Hey there. Welcome to Outlaw Icons, where history whispers in the dark. Tonight, we're stepping into the quiet world of Anthony Corallo. To most, he was just another name in New York's underworld. But to the people who really knew him, he was Tony Ducks, the man who could slip through indictments like smoke through your fingers. The Don who ran an empire not with blood and noise, but with silence, patience, and a business card smile. And for decades, he made fools of the feds. But every ghost leaves footprints. And in the end, even Tony Ducks couldn't stay invisible forever. Before we dive in, let me know down in the comments, where are you watching from, and what's the time where you are? It always amazes me seeing this little underworld stretch across so many countries and time zones. And hey, if you're new here, welcome to the crew. Go ahead and hit that subscribe button. Ring the bell too. That way, you won't miss the next dive into the shadows. Now, take a deep breath. Let the noise of the day fade away. And follow me into the quiet power of Tony Ducks. This is Outlaw Icons. Your Sleepy Dawn. Chapter 1. The Streets of East Harlem. The flashbulbs blinded him. Cameras exploded in rapid fire as the doors of the courthouse swung open. The quiet man, in the middle of it, all barely flinched. His hat brim angled low, his mouth set in something between a smirk and indifference. Reporters shouted his name, prosecutors snarled under their breath, and agents clenched their fists. But he moved like a ghost, slipping through the chaos with the same calm grace he'd shown all his life. Anthony Corallo, Tony Ducks, the Don who seemed untouchable. For decades, he had danced between indictments and convictions, ducking them all, earning a reputation as the man the law could never pin down. But how does a man learn to live like that? To carry himself with such quiet authority? To make power look like something worn as easily as a well-tailored suit? The answer doesn't begin in a courtroom or a wiretap. It begins decades earlier, in the crowded, restless streets of East Harlem, where poverty and opportunity walked hand in hand, and where a boy named Anthony learned that silence could be louder than any gunshot. The year was 1913, the same year he was born. East Harlem was alive, but not in the way polite society would describe it. Tenement buildings leaned into each other like tired old men. Laundry lines stretched across alleys like sagging flags of surrender. Children played stickball with broom handles, their laughter echoing off brick walls chipped and cracked from years of neglect. The air carried the scent of roasted chestnuts, sewer steam, and the faint sting of coal smoke. For immigrant families, East Harlem was both a promise and a punishment, a place where survival was possible, but never guaranteed. Anthony's parents were Sicilian immigrants. They arrived with little more than their faith and their names, part of the endless wave of families fleeing hardship, only to find a different kind of struggle waiting for them. His father worked long hours, bent over in thankless jobs that paid just enough to keep the family fed, but never enough to climb higher. His mother held the family together with the stubborn resilience of women who understood that the walls might crumble around them, but the family must not. The boy grew up in a world where men's hands were always calloused, and mothers' faces carried worry lines deeper than their years. At night, Anthony heard the muffled arguments of parents desperate to keep food on the table, while outside, the streets whispered their own lessons. Those whispers came from the corners, where older boys in sharp suits leaned against lampposts, flipping coins and commanding respect that no factory paycheck could buy. It didn't take long for Anthony to notice the contrast. His father worked himself ragged and was treated like nothing. These other men, they spoke softly, walked slowly, and the neighborhood bent around them. The grocer nodded with nervous politeness. The landlord turned generous with rent extensions, and even the cops seemed to look the other way when those men strolled by. Power wasn't about noise. It was about presence. And young Anthony learned that lesson before he was old enough to shave. In the 1920s, Prohibition had turned East Harlem into a playground for hustlers. Illegal liquor flowed through hidden doors and basement clubs. The clink of glasses and the hum of jazz spilled into streets that should have been quiet after dark. Gangsters weren't abstract legends to Anthony. They were neighbors, cousins of classmates, men whose names were whispered at Sunday dinners but never written down. The boy didn't need to be told which streets to avoid or which men to respect. He absorbed it, the way kids absorb language. It was in the air, in the rhythm of footsteps, in the sudden silences when authority passed by. Anthony wasn't reckless. He wasn't the kind of boy to pick fights or flash bravado. He was careful, observant, and deliberate. He watched how older men made deals without ever raising their voices. He saw how loyalty bought protection, and how betrayal was answered with swift, silent consequences. These weren't lessons written in books. They were lessons written in blood, in missing faces, in whispered rumors after funerals that ended too soon. The Great Depression crashed into East Harlem like a brick through a window. Jobs that had been scarce disappeared altogether. Breadlines snaked around blocks, and desperate men pawned their last possessions for coins. For Anthony's family, it was survival by inches. His father grew thinner, his mother more tired. But even in those years, Anthony noticed something else. The mob didn't seem to feel the depression the way everyone else did. Their suits still fit, their pockets still jingled, and their cars still gleamed. Where others starved, they thrived. To a boy watching his parents break under the weight of poverty, the difference was undeniable. He began running errands, small things at first, carrying envelopes, delivering packages, always told to keep his mouth shut and his head down. He did, and he did it well. He never asked questions. He never boasted. He never slipped up. In neighborhoods like East Harlem, kids who wanted to play tough usually ended up in shallow graves. But the quiet ones, the ones who listened, who waited, those were the ones who survived long enough to matter. Neighbors began to notice something about Anthony. He wasn't loud like the other boys. He wasn't reckless. He had a calmness about him, something unsettling for his age. When other kids shouted, he stayed silent. When they fought, he observed. And when he spoke, people listened, not because he demanded it, but because his words carried a weight far beyond his years. Every street had its characters. The corner hustlers, the small-time thieves, the drunks, the dreamers. But in East Harlem, there was also a hierarchy, and everyone knew who stood above it. Men like Tommy Lucchese were already carving their places into the city's underworld. And though Anthony was still just a boy, his path was quietly aligning with theirs. He didn't know it yet, but the streets were already drafting him into a world where silence was a shield and patience was a weapon. At night, Anthony sometimes lay awake listening to the muffled music drifting from speakeasies down the block. He imagined the smoke-filled rooms, the men in tailored suits, the deals being cut over glasses of forbidden whiskey. He thought of his father's bent back and weary hands, and he thought of the men who never seemed to break under the weight of anything. And slowly, the choice began to take shape in his mind, not as a rebellion, but as inevitability. He would not live as his father had lived, invisible, exhausted, forgotten. He would live like the men in the suits, the men whose whispers could move mountains. But the streets of East Harlem had a way of testing every choice. Violence was never far away. One wrong move could mean a beating, a stabbing, or worse. Kids disappeared, swallowed by the life too fast. Anthony saw it happen. A neighbor's son, just a year older than him, caught up in a robbery gone wrong. His name whispered for a week, then forgotten. Another boy, proud and reckless, left bleeding in an alley after crossing the wrong man. Anthony carried those images with him, burned into memory. They weren't warnings. They were reminders of the price of carelessness. And so, he remained deliberate. Even as a teenager, when hot blood pushed other boys into fights and foolish risks, Anthony kept his head cool. He walked with his hands in his pockets, his eyes scanning, his ears always open. Some mistook it for shyness. Others recognized it for what it was: control. East Harlem in the 1930s was a crucible. Italians, Irish, Jews, and Puerto Ricans crowded together, each group carving out space, each group fighting to survive. Tensions ran high. Fists flew over scraps of territory, over slights real and imagined. Cops patrolled, but mostly as referees, picking sides depending on who slipped them a bill. The law wasn't something people believed in. It was another game to be played, another tool to be bent. And Anthony, quietly, was already learning to bend it. He saw how some men always managed to escape justice. Not by force, but by finesse. They didn't beat the law. They sidestepped it. They paid the right man. They found the right lawyer. They disappeared when the heat came down. And each time Anthony saw it, the idea rooted deeper. Survival wasn't about being the strongest. It was about being the smartest. About being the one who knew when to speak and when to stay silent. By the time he was in his late teens, Anthony was no longer just another boy from East Harlem. He was a presence, subtle but undeniable. The older men noticed him. They saw the discipline, the quiet intelligence, the ability to move without drawing attention. And slowly, doors began to open. Small jobs turned into bigger ones. Trusted errands became confidential responsibilities. The boy who once ran envelopes now found himself sitting in the back of smoky bars, listening as men twice his age discussed unions, trucks, shipments, and strikes. He didn't talk. He didn't need to. His silence was his strength. And in a world where loose lips could bury you, silence was gold. Yet even as he rose quietly, the streets kept testing him. Friends fell away, some to prison, some to early graves. Anthony kept walking, steady, deliberate. The boy from the crowded tenement was shaping into something else entirely, something the feds would one day learn to fear. But for now, in the late 1930s, he was still just Anthony from East Harlem, a young man with watchful eyes and a calm that unsettled those around him. The world hadn't yet given him his nickname. The law hadn't yet learned to curse his existence. But the foundations were set. The lessons had been carved into him by poverty, by survival, by the streets themselves. And as the decade closed, one truth became clear. Anthony Corallo was no ordinary kid from the block. He was something rarer, something far more dangerous. He was a boy who had already learned to disappear in plain sight. The streets had molded him. The family had anchored him. The hunger for something more had driven him. And now, he stood on the edge of a world that would define him. The streets of East Harlem had given birth to many stories. But this one was different. This was the beginning of Tony Duck's, the quiet dawn. And as the city braced for another storm of violence, opportunity, and change, Anthony was already stepping quietly toward the shadows, where whispers ruled and silence reigned. He didn't know it yet, but his path was set, and the world would never hear him coming. Chapter 2. A young hustler in the rackets. The boy who had learned to disappear in plain sight was no longer just watching. By the late 1930s, Anthony Corallo had begun moving with a different rhythm, one shaped not by school or family, but by the pulse of East Harlem's underground. The shadows he once hovered near now began to open, inviting him in, testing whether he had the nerve, the patience, and the silence to survive. It started small. That's how it always started. A package to deliver, an envelope to carry, an errand whispered at the corner of a barroom where laughter covered the weight of the instructions. Anthony accepted these tasks without hesitation, not because he sought thrill, but because he understood something others his age did not. These were not just errands. They were additions. Each one was a test of loyalty, discretion, and discipline. He didn't ask questions. He didn't linger in places he didn't belong. He did what was asked, returned quietly, and disappeared again into the city's noise. And each time he came back with the job done, another door cracked open. East Harlem in those years was still shaking off the ghost of Prohibition. Officially, bootlegging had died when the country repealed the ban on liquor. But the habits, the networks, the hunger it had unleashed never really left. The speakeasies were gone, at least by name, but the backrooms and basements remained. Illegal liquor turned into numbers games, loan sharking, and protection rackets. The city was alive with hustles, big and small, and every boy with sharp eyes dreamed of cutting himself a piece of it. Anthony wasn't the kind of teenager who bragged about what he did. Others would boast after running an errand, puffing out their chests, pretending to be gangsters before they were even old enough to buy a drink. Anthony didn't. He carried himself with quietness that made older men look twice. Silence, after all, was rarer than bravado. One night, he was told to stand watch outside a bar while a group of older boys met inside with men who smelled of power. The job was simple. Keep an eye on the street. Whistle if anyone suspicious approached. Hours passed. The cold gnawed at him, but he never complained, never left his post. When the meeting ended, the older boys stumbled out, drunk on whiskey and self-importance. One of them sneered, mocking Anthony for standing out there like a fool. But inside the bar, one of the men, a man whose name carried weight, had noticed the boy's patience. Not everyone could wait in the cold, silent and still, for hours without complaint. Anthony had passed another test. The streets were full of kids who wanted quick money. They snatched wallets, broke into cars, lifted whatever they could. Most ended up caught, or worse. But Anthony's path bent differently. He wasn't interested in scraps. He wanted a seat at the table, the kind where money flowed steadily, the kind where the law bent rather than broke you. He knew that small-time crimes were like sparks. They flared bright and burned out quickly. But the rackets? The rackets were fire that never went out. Numbers was one of the first games he dipped into. The Italian neighborhoods ran their own variations, daily lotteries where poor families bet small coins for a chance at a miracle. On the surface, it looked like harmless gambling, but it was big money for the men who controlled it. Anthony carried slips, collected coins, learned the rhythms of the game. More importantly, he learned who to trust and who to avoid. The cops looked the other way, sometimes for money, sometimes for fear. And the people playing the game? They didn't see him as a criminal. They saw him as a part of the neighborhood. The numbers racket was woven into daily life, as common as buying bread. The jobs grew riskier. A debt needed collecting. A shopkeeper refusing to pay protection needed persuasion. Anthony wasn't the one holding the bat, but he was there, standing in the corner, watching, learning how pressure was applied. It wasn't always about violence. Sometimes a glance was enough. Sometimes a promise, softly spoken, carried more weight than a fist. Anthony studied those moments like a student studies scripture. He saw that real power wasn't about who shouted the loudest. It was about who could command obedience without raising their voice. The world outside was darkening with the shadow of war. Europe was burning, and America stood on the edge of entering. In East Harlem, that tension mixed with the usual struggles. Jobs were scarce, money tighter than ever. Gangs filled the void, offering boys a chance to eat, to dress better, to matter. Anthony moved through this storm like a man twice his age, never drawing attention, always delivering. By the time he was barely out of his teens, he was already a trusted pair of hands. One evening, he was asked to ride along on a job involving a shipment. Trucks were the lifeblood of the city, moving goods, feeding businesses, fueling rackets. Whoever controlled, trucking controlled everything. The job was simple on paper. Make sure the shipment made it from one warehouse to another without incident. But in the underworld, simple jobs often turned complicated. Another crew had eyes on the shipment. Rivalry in those years wasn't fought with corporate lawyers. It was fought with steel pipes and pistols. Anthony kept his composure. He stayed low, stayed alert, never panicked. When the dust cleared, the shipment was delivered intact. The men in charge took notice. Word spread quietly. There was a young man from East Harlem who could be trusted. He didn't brag. He didn't crack under pressure. He kept his mouth shut. In a world where silence was priceless, Anthony's value soared. Still, danger was everywhere. One wrong step, and he could have ended up another forgotten name in the police blotter. He saw it happen often. A boy he knew, too eager for glory, caught skimming money and left face down in the gutter. Another, reckless with his temper, picked a fight with the wrong man and vanished, his mother crying into the night with no body to bury. These stories carved themselves into Anthony's mind, not as deterrents, but as reminders. The path he was walking demanded caution. He could play the game, but only if he played it smarter than everyone else. As the 30s gave way to the 40s, the underworld shifted. Prohibition's kings faded, and new empires rose on racketeering, unions, and construction. The Lucchese crew, already building its influence, was watching for men who could be trusted, men who could work quietly, men who wouldn't draw heat. Anthony fit the mold perfectly. He wasn't a headline maker. He wasn't a headline seeker. He was the kind of man who could operate in the shadows for years, invisible until it was too late. In East Harlem's narrow alleys and crowded bars, Anthony had transformed from a boy watching the older men to a young hustler earning alongside them. He had stepped fully into the world that once only whispered to him. The quiet boy had become a quiet operator, moving between gangs, rackets, and unions, learning the ropes of an empire still being built. But the story was only beginning. The tests ahead would be harder, the risks greater. The envelopes would grow thicker, the eyes watching him sharper. And the boy who had mastered silence would soon learn that silence could not only make him rich, it could make him powerful. And as the city of New York braced for a new decade of war abroad and shifting power at home, Anthony Corallo stood ready, still quiet, still deliberate, but now undeniably part of the machine. What he didn't know yet was that the machine was watching him too. And soon, the Lucchese family itself would reach out from the shadows and pull him deeper than he had ever gone before. Chapter 3. First Ties to the Mafia. The moment that changed everything didn't happen with a gunshot or a chase. It happened in a back room, so small the smoke from the cigars hung like a curtain, making it hard to see the men across the table. Anthony sat there, barely out of his teens, listening more than speaking, learning more than acting. He was no longer just a quiet kid running errands on cold nights. Now, he was in the presence of men whose names made other men lower their voices. Among them was Gaetano Lucchese, better known as Tommy. And Tommy didn't waste time with boys who weren't going anywhere. Anthony had been noticed. That was the first step. In neighborhoods like East Harlem, being noticed could be a blessing or a death sentence. The wrong eyes on you, and your life could end in an alley before it began. But being noticed by Lucchese's crew, that was opportunity. It meant you'd been measured, weighed, and found to have something worth testing. Tommy Lucchese wasn't looking for showboats. He wanted quiet earners. Men who could think, who wouldn't bring the law crashing down with reckless moves. And in Anthony, he saw exactly that. The introduction wasn't formal, not in the way outsiders imagine. No ritual, no ceremony. It was a nod, a handshake, an understanding that from now on, Anthony belonged to a circle far smaller and far more dangerous than anything he had known before. The Mafia wasn't just a gang. It was an organism. It breathed through loyalty, it fed on fear, and it lived by rules that outsiders couldn't understand. To survive inside it, you had to make those rules part of your blood. Tommy Lucchese was a teacher in his own way. He taught not with lectures, but with examples. Anthony learned by watching him handle disputes, by noticing the way he smoothed over problems without raising his voice. Violence was always an option, but it was never the first one. A man like Lucchese didn't need a shout to be heard. His power radiated from his calm, the same way Anthony's quiet presence had already begun to unsettle people his own age. Perhaps that was why Tommy favored him. He saw in Anthony a reflection of his own philosophy. That power was most effective when it didn't need to announce itself. For Anthony, the lessons were constant. Sitting in on a meeting between union men and mob captains, he saw how a single pause could shift the balance of a negotiation. Watching envelopes slide across tables, he understood how politics and business were woven into the mob's daily bread. He saw that control wasn't about guns. It was about influence. A union leader in your pocket meant more than 10 soldiers with pistols. A handshake could earn millions. A favor could outlast a bullet. Still, the streets demanded their due. Racketeering wasn't theory. It was practice, tested daily by rivals, cops, and the unpredictable chaos of New York City. Anthony ran with men who shook down shopkeepers, controlled truck routes, and guarded gambling dens. He learned the subtle dance of intimidation. How to lean just enough to make a man fold without ever raising your hand. It was theater as much as threat, and Anthony played his part with natural ease. But every test carried risk. One night, he was told to accompany two older associates on a collection. A store owner had fallen behind on payments. They entered quietly, locked the door, and spoke in low voices. The man trembled, swore he'd pay, begged for time. The older associate grew impatient, his hand twitching toward his coat. Anthony watched the fear in the shopkeeper's eyes, and he stepped forward. He spoke softly, calmly, promising that a little cooperation would make the problem disappear. The tension broke. The money came out, and the older associate, though annoyed, realized what Anthony had done. He had prevented unnecessary violence. He had kept the man paying, rather than pushing him into desperation. It was a small moment, but it rippled through the crew. Anthony had proven he understood the long game. The nickname still hadn't come. To most, he was just Anthony, but the qualities that would define him were already forming. He wasn't reckless. He wasn't greedy. He was cautious, deliberate, and effective. And in a world where too many young men burned out fast, that made him valuable. Lucchese kept him close, not as a protege in the sentimental sense, but as a tool to be sharpened. He let Anthony sit in on deals involving trucking companies, where unions were bent into submission, where entire industries shifted hands with the passing of an envelope. These were rackets that built fortunes quietly, without blood on the sidewalks. For a young man eager to escape the small-time hustles, it was an education in real power. Anthony also learned the other side of the coin, discipline. In the Mafia, mistakes weren't forgiven. A word spoken carelessly could destroy a crew. A lie told to the wrong man could end in a grave. The rules weren't written down, but they were carved into every move. Loyalty to your family above all else, silence in the face of the law, obedience to the chain of command. Break them, and you didn't get second chances. He saw the price of disobedience firsthand. One of the young men he'd come up with grew too bold, skimming from collections, boasting in bars. One night, he disappeared. His body was found days later, dumped in the river, the kind of death that carried more message than mystery. Anthony absorbed the lesson. This life wasn't about playing tough. It was about survival, about walking carefully through a minefield where every step mattered. By the early 1940s, Anthony had crossed an invisible line. He wasn't just running errands anymore. He was trusted. He was earning. And he was being shaped by the culture of men like Lucchese, men who believed that the smartest criminals were the ones who could live like ghosts, present, powerful, but rarely seen. The city was changing. The war overseas created new opportunities. Shortages meant black markets flourished. Men returned from battle-hardened, desperate for work, easy to recruit into rackets that promised quick money. The Mafia expanded, its roots digging deeper into construction, shipping, and the garment industry. Anthony was there for it all, quietly building his reputation as someone who could be relied on, someone who understood the balance between fear and respect. He never rushed. He never demanded more than what was given. That patience became his signature. In a world full of men eager to climb fast, Anthony climbed slowly, but he never slipped. And that, more than anything, made him stand out. By now, whispers followed him. The quiet kid from East Harlem, the one who never seemed rattled, the one Lucchese kept close. He wasn't flashy, but people noticed. And in the Mafia, sometimes being noticed was the first step toward becoming indispensable. Yet Anthony knew enough not to get comfortable. He had seen too many rise fast only to vanish faster. His strength was in his caution, his ability to sense danger before it struck. That instinct would serve him for decades, keeping him alive, keeping him free, while others fell around him. But in these early years, he was still learning, still absorbing the values that would define him. Loyalty, silence, patience. They weren't just rules. They were survival tools. They were the armor that allowed a man to move through the Mafia's world without being destroyed by it. And as the 40s deepened, as Lucchese's influence expanded, Anthony Corallo found himself standing at the threshold of something far larger than the small-time rackets he had known. He wasn't just a hustler anymore. He was part of a crew, part of an organism that stretched across the city, pulling strings others couldn't even see. It was no longer a question of whether he belonged. The only question now was how far he could go. The answer would come soon enough. But with every step deeper into Lucchese's world, Anthony was binding himself tighter to rules that could never be broken. And somewhere in the shadows, the law was already beginning to take notice. Because for every door that opened in the underworld, another set of eyes began watching from above. And as Anthony Corallo stepped further into his apprenticeship under Lucchese, he had no way of knowing that his silence, the very thing that made him valuable, would one day become the obsession of the federal agents sworn to break him. Chapter 4. The Rise of a Reliable Soldier. The shot rang out in the dark, shattering the calm of the East Harlem night. A hothead chasing glory had pulled his pistol too fast, too loud, leaving a body bleeding on the sidewalk and a trail of witnesses too shaken to stay silent. Within hours, the cops were circling, reporters scribbling, and the whole neighborhood buzzing. For most men in that world, chaos was the norm. But for Anthony Corallo, this was the perfect example of what not to be. He watched the fallout closely, quietly, and made himself a promise. He would never be that careless. If the Mafia was a chessboard, he would be a player who thought 10 moves ahead. The quiet apprentice under Tommy Lucchese was now stepping into something more defined. Anthony was no longer the boy fetching envelopes or sitting silently in backrooms. He was becoming a soldier, one whose value was not measured in blood spilled, but in problems avoided. His discipline set him apart in a world where too many were eager to prove themselves with fists and bullets. He didn't need to. He proved himself by being the man you could depend on when the heat was unbearable, the stakes were high, and silence was the only shield worth carrying. The 40s were a turbulent time for New York's underworld. The end of Prohibition had shifted the landscape, and the war had reshaped the economy. Soldiers were returning home, industries were booming, and rackets were evolving. The Mafia was expanding its reach into unions, construction, and trucking. It needed men who could operate like businessmen as much as street enforcers. And Anthony Corallo fit that mold perfectly. When crews needed someone to oversee a union negotiation, Anthony was there, sitting quietly at the table, making sure the right hands were shaken and the right envelopes exchanged. He didn't interrupt. He didn't posture. He let older men talk themselves into knots, and then, with a calm suggestion, he'd bring the room back to order. People listened, not because his voice was loud, but because it carried weight. He had that rare quality, the ability to steady a room with nothing more than his presence. Contrast him with the other young men of his era, and the difference was stark. Many of them chased quick money through stick-ups, hijackings, or street-level violence. They were hot sparks in a cold night, burning bright but short. Anthony chose another path. He invested his time in the steady rackets, the ones that promised longevity. Trucking routes, union dues, protection that kept businesses paying year after year. It wasn't flashy. It wasn't the kind of thing that landed you in headlines. But it was steady, and steady was power. He gained a reputation inside Lucchese's crew. If you wanted a job done without noise, you gave it to Anthony. If you needed a man to hold a secret, you trusted him. He wasn't the one kicking in doors, but he was the one making sure those doors kept producing money long after the bruises healed. That reliability, more than violence, was what made him valuable. But reliability in the Mafia came with tests. One night, he was ordered to mediate a brewing feud between two small crews over territory in the garment district. It was the kind of situation that could spiral into bloodshed. Anthony listened to both sides, nodding, letting tempers flare. And then, with a calm voice, he reminded them of the bigger picture, the money. Blood would bring cops. Blood would scare off business. But peace meant profits. By the end of the night, the crews shook hands, each side believing they'd won. Anthony had done what bullets could not. He preserved the flow of money. Lucchese took note. The more he proved himself, the more responsibility came his way. He oversaw trucking contracts, making sure shipments flowed smoothly, guarded by men who answered to him. He learned how to skim without drawing suspicion, how to move money quietly through fronts and shell companies. The world he was building wasn't the chaotic street life of young gangsters. It was something bigger, more organized, more enduring. He was learning to treat crime like business. In this, Anthony embodied the new wave of Mafia leadership. The old generation had been forged in prohibition, men who made their names in violence and smuggling. The new generation, Anthony among them, would rule through influence and financial control. They weren't just criminals. They were businessmen in shadows, turning unions into piggy banks and industries into private fiefdoms. Yet even as he rose, he never abandoned the quiet discipline that defined him. He didn't dress loud. He didn't flash wealth. He didn't crave the spotlight. Where others bought fancy cars and paraded them through the neighborhood, Anthony kept his movements understated. His luxury was invisibility. His power was the fact that you didn't see it until it was already surrounding you. Still, there were moments that tested that invisibility. Arrests came. Charges were filed. And each time, somehow, Anthony slipped free. Evidence went missing. Witnesses changed their stories. Jurors grew uncertain. It happened so often that whispers began. The law could never pin him. He ducked cases like water slipping off stone. It was the beginning of the legend, though he didn't wear it yet. That would come later, when the nickname Tony Ducks clung to him like a second skin. His reliability wasn't just about discipline. It was about loyalty. In a world where betrayal was constant, Anthony never wavered. He kept his mouth shut when others broke. He protected his crew's interests with quiet ferocity. That loyalty made him untouchable inside the organization. Men trusted him with their secrets, their money, even their lives. And in the Mafia, trust was currency more valuable than gold. But trust had its shadows. It meant he was often brought into situations others wouldn't dare touch. One night, he was told to oversee the transfer of a major shipment, something so valuable that rival crews were watching, waiting for a chance to strike. The pressure was immense. One mistake could mean disaster. Anthony managed it flawlessly, moving the goods under cover of night, with decoys and distractions that threw off anyone tailing them. By dawn, the shipment was safe. His crew celebrated. Anthony stayed quiet, simply nodding, already thinking of the next move. That was the difference. Others lived in the highs of victory, the adrenaline of danger. Anthony lived in the planning, the steady climb. He was never satisfied, never reckless enough to relax. That mindset, more than muscle, kept him alive. By the mid-40s, his reputation had solidified. He wasn't just another soldier. He was a reliable one, a man you could count on when things got complicated. Lucchese himself leaned on him more often, trusting him with responsibilities that shaped the family's future. Anthony had gone from a boy in East Harlem to a quiet power in the Lucchese crew, all without raising his voice, all without flashing a weapon. But that kind of rise carried its own risks. The more valuable he became, the more attention he attracted, not just from his family, but from rivals, from enemies, from the law. He was moving up the ladder, and the higher he climbed, the more dangerous the fall would be. And yet, Anthony didn't hesitate. He embraced the climb, knowing his silence, his patience, and his loyalty would carry him further than any pistol could. What he didn't know was that in proving himself, he was setting in motion a reputation that would follow him for decades. He wasn't just a soldier anymore. He was becoming the man everyone turned to, the one who could outthink, outlast, and outmaneuver. And in the shadows of New York, whispers had already begun. There was a man in Lucchese's crew who never cracked, never panicked, never failed. His name was Antonio Corallo, and the world had only just begun to understand what that meant. Chapter 5. From Driver to Trusted Earner. The car door slammed, echoing through the quiet street, and the engine purred to life. Antonio Corallo sat behind the wheel, hands steady, eyes fixed on the road ahead. It seemed simple enough, just another night driving a boss across town. But in the world of organized crime, nothing was ever simple. Being a driver wasn't just about getting someone from one place to another. It was about trust. It was about proximity. It was about sitting close enough to hear whispers not meant for outsiders, close enough to witness the real heart of the business. In that seat, Anthony wasn't just a chauffeur. He was an apprentice at the very center of power. This is where his reputation began to shift. He had already proven himself as a reliable soldier, the kind of man who didn't crack under pressure. Now he was being tested in a new way. The driver's seat became his classroom, the city streets his textbooks, and the bosses in the back his teachers. Every turn of the wheel brought him deeper into the mechanics of an empire that operated on steel, sweat, and silence. Trucking was the first world he entered. It wasn't glamorous. It didn't make headlines like shootings or robberies. But in New York, trucks were arteries feeding the city. They moved food, clothing, materials, everything. Whoever controlled trucking didn't just control commerce. They controlled survival. Anthony quickly understood that this was power on a different scale. It wasn't about muscle. It was about leverage. If a company refused to play along, its trucks stopped moving. Shelves went empty. Projects stalled. Suddenly, businessmen who thought themselves untouchable were on their knees, begging for cooperation. Anthony watched, listened, and absorbed. He saw how deals were struck, how union leaders were courted, pressured, or bought outright. He noticed how money flowed quietly from paychecks to envelopes, from envelopes to pockets, from pockets into the coffers of the family. And he played his part with precision. He made deliveries. He collected dues. He passed messages. Always on time. Always discreet. Always reliable. Each small job was another brick in the foundation of his future power. Sanitation was next. On the surface, it looked like garbage collection, trucks hauling away the waste of a city that never stopped producing it. But underneath, it was a gold mine. Controlling sanitation meant controlling contracts, dictating prices, and making sure no competitor could muscle in without paying tribute. It was business disguised as necessity. After all, no one could afford a city where the trash wasn't collected. Anthony became a quiet presence in this world too, moving between truck yards, union halls, and city officials' offices. He wasn't the loudest man in the room. He was the one who left with the signatures that mattered. The unions tied it all together. They were the gears that kept the machine turning. Truckers, sanitation workers, construction crews, they all belonged to unions. And unions, when controlled by the Mafia, became weapons. They could launch strikes that crippled industries. They could inflate costs, delay projects, or speed them up. They could turn labor into leverage, forcing businessmen and politicians alike to bow to demands. Anthony understood this instinctively. Controlling unions wasn't about taking money from workers. It was about turning the very structure of the city into a tool for profit. His discipline and caution earned him more responsibility. He wasn't a driver forever. Soon, he was the man delivering envelopes thick with cash, the man overseeing deals that stretched far beyond East Harlem. His territory was no longer just a block or a corner. It was contracts, companies, entire sectors of the city's economy. And the bosses noticed. They saw in him not just a soldier, but an earner. Someone who could bring in money without leaving blood on the sidewalk. What set him apart was his ability to balance fear and respect. He knew when to lean on a man and when to ease up. He knew that a businessman who paid because he was scared might stop paying once the fear passed. But a businessman who paid because he saw no other choice, because Anthony made it look like the natural order of things, would keep paying forever. Anthony's power wasn't in threats. It was an inevitability. The city itself became his classroom. Driving through the Bronx, Brooklyn, and Manhattan, he memorized every warehouse, every truck yard, every union hall. He learned who owed money, who could be squeezed, and who needed protecting. He learned which cops were on the payroll and which ones needed reminders to look the other way. Knowledge was power, and Anthony gathered it like coins, pocketing it quietly, never flaunting it, never wasting it. Meanwhile, the hotheads kept burning out. Some robbed trucks, only to get shot by guards or arrested by police. Others beat businessmen senseless, only to scare away future profits. Anthony watched them fall, one after another, and he stayed the course. He didn't need quick glory. He wanted something that lasted. And, slowly, that patience began to pay. By the late 40s, he was no longer just another young man in Lucchese's orbit. He was a trusted earner, someone who could be counted on to manage entire rackets. He oversaw trucking routes, union negotiations, and sanitation contracts with the calm authority of a man twice his age. His rise was quiet, almost invisible, but undeniable. And in the Mafia, invisibility was the greatest strength of all. Still, he wasn't untouchable. Arrests came, as they always did. He faced charges tied to union shakedowns, trucking disputes, and racketeering. But somehow, he always slipped free. Evidence vanished. Witnesses recanted. Juries wavered. Each time he walked, his legend grew. The law couldn't pin him down. Not yet. Not ever, it seemed. The nickname had not yet become common. He wasn't Tony Ducks just yet. But the pattern was there. Each acquittal, each dismissal, each narrow escape built toward it. Prosecutors grew frustrated. Detectives cursed his name. To them, he was already the ghost they couldn't catch. His role as a driver had been more than transportation. It had been his apprenticeship, his doorway into the inner circle. From there, he had stepped into rackets that controlled industries, into unions that bent the city to the Mafia's will. He had proven himself not just as a soldier, but as an earner, a builder, a man who could transform silence into profit. But every rise carries risk. The more he earned, the more attention he drew, from rivals, from law enforcement, even from ambitious men inside his own family. The Mafia was a world where loyalty was sacred, but envy was constant. And Anthony's quiet success was beginning to cast long shadows. In the years to come, those shadows would stretch further, reaching into the highest levels of power, pulling him closer to the center of the Mafia's empire. But for now, he was still climbing, still proving, still building a foundation that would make him one of the most enduring figures in organized crime. The boy who once watched from the cold corners of East Harlem had become a man whose presence shaped entire industries. His wheel, his patience, his silence had carried him from driver to trusted earner. And yet, as steady as his rise was, the world around him was shifting. The Mafia was growing bolder. The law was growing sharper. And the path ahead was lined with dangers that even Anthony's caution might not be able to dodge forever. The question now was simple, but deadly. How long could he keep ducking the inevitable? Chapter 6. Arrests and the Tony Ducks nickname. The gavel cracked down, echoing through the courtroom like a gunshot. All eyes turned toward Anthony Corallo. Reporters scribbled furiously. Prosecutors leaned forward with triumph already painted on their faces, and federal agents whispered to one another. This time they thought they had him. The charges were strong, the witnesses lined up, the evidence supposedly airtight. It seemed impossible for him to walk away yet again. But Anthony sat motionless, his expression carved from stone. He wasn't sweating, wasn't shifting in his chair. He looked more like a man waiting for a train than a man staring down years in prison. And when the verdict came, not guilty, the courtroom erupted. Agents slammed their fists in frustration. Prosecutors cursed under their breath. And Anthony, he simply stood, straightened his suit, and walked calmly out the door, as though it had been decided long before the jury spoke. This wasn't the first time, and it wouldn't be the last. By the late 1940s and into the 50s, Anthony Corallo was becoming as well known in federal circles as he was in the streets. But not for the reasons the government wanted. Every time they built a case against him, it crumbled. Witnesses turned unreliable. Juries lost their nerve. Evidence went missing. Time after time, he ducked convictions, slipping through the cracks like water through cupped hands. And slowly, almost inevitably, a nickname took hold: Tony Ducks. It was born in whispers first, among prosecutors and agents who couldn't stand the sight of him walking free. But it spread because it fit. He didn't dodge bullets in back alleys. He dodged indictments. He ducked charges. He evaded the traps that swallowed other men whole. While hotheads rotted in prison, Anthony moved forward, untouched. The arrests came in waves. Labor racketeering, extortion, conspiracy. Time after time, He was marched into courtrooms under flashing cameras, his face blank, his hat brim low, reporters shouting his name. And each time, the story ended the same way. Acquittal, dismissal, mistrial. It became almost predictable, a ritual that frustrated the law as much as it strengthened Anthony's myth. The prosecutors seethed. They said he corrupted juries, that he bought silence with envelopes of cash, that he leaned on witnesses until their stories broke. Maybe he did. Maybe he didn't. The truth was simpler. He knew the rules better than they did. He understood that in America, the justice system wasn't built only on truth. It was built on procedure. And if you were patient, careful, and disciplined, you could turn that procedure into armor. Anthony's calm in these moments set him apart. Most men cracked when the heat came down. They panicked, made mistakes, confessed things they shouldn't. Anthony never did. He carried himself with the same steady presence in a courtroom as he did in a union hall. He didn't fidget. He didn't raise his voice. He let the lawyers fight, the prosecutors bluster, the judges frown. And he waited. Always, he waited. It wasn't just luck. It was preparation. He surrounded himself with attorneys who knew the system inside and out, who could argue technicalities until the charges unraveled. He made sure that when the feds came knocking, there was never enough on paper to bury him. He built relationships with men in politics, in unions, even in law enforcement. They didn't see him as a criminal. They saw him as a businessman, a negotiator, a quiet man who kept the wheels of the city turning. That network of influence was as much a shield as any lawyer or jury. And with each acquittal, his power grew. On the streets, men marveled at his ability to escape the clutches of the law. To them, it meant he was untouchable, chosen, protected by something larger than luck. In the Mafia, reputation was currency, and Anthony's reputation was now worth more than gold. He wasn't just reliable. He was invincible. But the nickname carried weight beyond admiration. Tony Ducks. It was a badge of honor in the underworld, but it was also a red flag to the law. Federal agents grew obsessed. They wanted to be the ones who finally clipped his wings, who dragged Tony Ducks down and kept him there. Each time he walked free, their frustration deepened, and their determination hardened. His ability to duck them made him a target they could never stop aiming at. The irony was that Anthony never asked for the nickname. He never bragged about it, never used it. He let others whisper it, let it build its own life in the shadows. To him, it was simply survival. To prosecutors, it was humiliation. To the Mafia, it was legend. The 1950s became a cycle of arrest and release. The headlines wrote themselves. Corallo indicted. Corallo acquitted. Over and over. Each case that fell apart only reinforced his image as the man the law could never hold. And behind those headlines, Anthony kept working, kept building, kept earning. Trucking, sanitation, construction, unions. His empire expanded quietly, brick by brick, while the law chased shadows. There was a story once told among agents who had spent years trying to trap him. One of them said it felt like hunting smoke. You could see it, smell it, even choke on it. But try to grab it, and it slipped through your fingers. That was Tony Ducks. Always there, never caught. But with every dismissal, with every charge that vanished into nothing, the stakes rose higher. Anthony knew it. The law knew it. Each escape brought him closer to the moment when patience might no longer be enough, when the system might bend too far to protect him. For now, though, he walked free, his legend solidifying, his power cementing. The young driver who had once ferried bosses through the city was now the man everyone pointed to as the embodiment of Mafia resilience. He had outlasted prosecutors, sidestepped indictments, and built a reputation that struck fear in rivals and fury in agents. Tony Ducks wasn't just a nickname anymore. It was a brand. And yet, behind the calm exterior, Anthony knew something others did not. Every case he ducked made the law more desperate. Every acquittal added another name to the list of people who wanted to see him fall. His silence, his discipline, his patience, they had carried him this far. But the road ahead was narrowing, because the law had begun to change. New weapons were being forged, new strategies designed to pierce the very armor that had protected him for decades. And while Tony Ducks kept walking free, somewhere in the halls of power, the government was already plotting the case that might finally hold him. Chapter 7. The Lucchese Family Connection. The restaurant was quiet except for the clinking of silverware and the low hum of conversation. In the back, behind a curtain that separated the curious from the connected, men gathered around a table where decisions worth millions were made in whispers. Antonio Corallo sat there, not as a boy on the periphery, not as a driver waiting outside, but as a man who now had a seat in the room. Across from him sat Tommy Lucchese, small in stature, sharp in mind, a boss who understood that real power lived in silence. It was here, in moments like this, that Anthony's transformation deepened. He wasn't just surviving anymore. He was learning to lead. Tommy Lucchese was no ordinary mob boss. Where others flaunted power with violence, he wielded it with calculation. He dressed neatly, but never extravagantly, spoke softly, but with authority, and kept a low profile that allowed him to operate for decades without drawing the kind of heat that buried flashier men. For Anthony, this was a masterclass in the art of invisibility. He had already learned discipline in the streets, already proven himself reliable in the rackets. But under Lucchese, he absorbed something more profound: how to lead without ever appearing to. The Lucchese family in the 1940s and 50s was expanding rapidly. They held sway over trucking, unions, construction, and the garment district. These were not the splashy crimes of Hollywood imagination. These were industries, entire sectors of the city's economy, bent to their will. Anthony became a trusted lieutenant in this machine. He handled trucking routes, oversaw negotiations, and smoothed disputes before they ever became headlines. What struck people was how unremarkable he appeared. He wasn't the kind of man to pound the table or scream threats. Instead, he leaned in, spoke quietly, and made his point in a way that left no room for doubt. Businessmen often left meetings with him unsettled, unable to explain why they had agreed to terms that heavily favored his side. It wasn't fear in the traditional sense. It was something subtler, like agreeing with gravity. You didn't fight it, because it was simply the way things worked. Lucchese saw this and valued it. He kept Anthony close, not just to carry out orders, but to watch and learn. The two of them often rode together, visited union halls, or sat in the back of social clubs where the real business happened. Anthony studied every gesture, every pause, every piece of advice his mentor offered. And what he took away was simple but powerful. Survival and success in this life depended on staying small in the eyes of the world, even as your influence grew enormous behind the scenes. Other bosses in New York lived differently. They hosted lavish parties, paraded mistresses, bought flashy cars. They drew attention, and with attention came investigations, indictments, and the inevitable downfall. Lucchese, and by extension Anthony, avoided all of that. They dressed like businessmen, lived in modest houses, and kept their names off the front page. It was leadership by subtraction. The less the world saw, the more power they had. Anthony's reputation as a dependable earner grew under this guidance. He made sure union leaders stayed in line, trucking companies kept paying, and sanitation contracts flowed through the right channels. When disputes threatened to escalate into violence, he intervened before blood could spill, always framing the argument around money. Violence was messy. Violence brought attention. Money, on the other hand, kept flowing quietly, month after month, year after year. But being close to Lucchese also meant carrying risks. Anthony knew that sitting near power meant being in the crosshairs of rivals and law enforcement. The feds were watching. Other families were watching. Any misstep could bring the kind of scrutiny that no amount of silence could deflect. Still, Anthony stayed steady. He had ducked enough cases by now to trust his instincts. And under Lucchese's mentorship, he refined those instincts into tools that would serve him for life. There was a moment in the early 50s that defined this new stage. A labor dispute threatened to shut down a series of construction projects in Manhattan. The unions were restless. The developers panicked, and rival families circled like sharks, ready to exploit the chaos. Anthony stepped in, sent by Lucchese to steady the waters. He listened to the union men, offered subtle threats without raising his voice, and then reminded the developers what delay would cost them. Within days, the dispute was settled. The projects moved forward, and both sides understood that the Lucchese family's presence had been the deciding factor. It was Anthony's quiet efficiency that made it possible. These victories did more than earn money. They built credibility. Inside the family, Anthony was now seen as a man who could be trusted with sensitive operations. Outside, businessmen and union leaders knew that dealing with him meant stability, as long as they played by the rules. He wasn't feared in the way violent men were feared. He was respected, which in the underworld often lasted longer. Lucchese himself appreciated this difference. He once remarked that flashy men burned bright and fast, but quiet men endured. And Anthony was nothing if not quiet. His ability to move through rooms without drawing attention, to make deals that left everyone convinced they had gotten the better end, was becoming legendary. Slowly, the boy from East Harlem was evolving into something greater, a future leader, molded by one of the sharpest minds in Mafia history. But the mentorship was also a reminder of mortality. Anthony watched as older men around him began to fall, some to prison, some to illness, some to bullets. No matter how careful they were, the life carried risk. Each funeral was both a warning and an opportunity. The hierarchy shifted constantly, and those who endured were the ones prepared to step into the gaps. Anthony didn't rush. He didn't push. He simply stayed steady, building his base, waiting for the right moment. In the streets, his nickname was already cementing. Tony Ducks, the man the law couldn't catch. But inside the family, he was becoming something more, the embodiment of Lucchese's philosophy. Low profile, steady, and quietly powerful. His future was no longer a question of if he would rise, but when. And yet, as Anthony grew closer to Lucchese, the world around them was changing. The government was experimenting with new laws, new tactics, ways to strike at the Mafia that went beyond the old cat-and-mouse games. For decades, the underworld had thrived on silence and invisibility. But what Anthony didn't know was that the shadows he had mastered were slowly being stripped away, inch by inch, by men who would stop at nothing to bring him down. For now, though, he was protected. He had Lucchese's trust, the family's respect, and a reputation that kept him untouchable. He was no longer just surviving the world of organized crime. He was shaping it, one quiet deal at a time. But every apprenticeship ends, and the moment was approaching when Anthony would no longer be the student. The day would come when he would have to carry everything he had learned, not as a follower, but as the man in charge. And in that future, every lesson, every whispered piece of wisdom from Lucchese would be tested in ways that even Anthony couldn't yet imagine. Chapter 8: Building the Labor Rackets Empire. The truck doors slammed shut with a metallic thud, and for a moment the loading dock echoed like a drum. Workers moved nervously, eyes darting toward the men in suits standing at the edge of the yard. It wasn't the cops they feared. It was the quiet presence of the Mafia, men who never lifted a finger, yet controlled every hand on the job. And among them, Antonio Corallo was becoming a figure who didn't need to say much at all. His silence carried weight heavier than any threat. His nod determined whether a shipment moved or sat rotting. This wasn't about muscle anymore. It was about control, complete, invisible control. By the early 1950s, Anthony had evolved beyond the role of student under Tommy Lucchese. He was now building something of his own. The rackets he oversaw were no longer corner hustles or small-time shakedowns. They were industries. And the empire he was quietly constructing would define not just his career, but the economy of New York itself. It started with trucking. To most people, a truck was just a truck, another machine grinding through the streets, delivering goods no one thought twice about. But to the Mafia, trucks were veins, pumping lifeblood into the city. Whoever controlled trucking controlled the flow of food, clothing, and supplies. And Corallo understood this better than most. He worked his way into the Teamsters union, forging connections with drivers and officials alike. The message was simple: cooperate and life goes smoothly. Resist and nothing moves. Strikes became weapons. A single call from the right union official could paralyze an entire block of Manhattan. Deliveries halted, warehouses filled with spoiled goods, and desperate businessmen found themselves with no choice but to make deals. Anthony learned to use these strikes not as blunt instruments, but as scalpels, carefully applied pressure that made businessmen fold without ever drawing blood. He wasn't robbing trucks at gunpoint. He was making sure the trucks themselves bent to his will. From trucking, his influence spread into the garment district. Manhattan's garment center was a jungle of factories, showrooms, and warehouses. Clothing didn't just appear on racks. It was moved by trucks, stitched by workers, and guarded by contracts that could be bent, broken, or sold. Anthony saw the opportunity. By controlling the trucking companies that serviced the district, he effectively controlled the industry itself. Designers and manufacturers learned quickly that without his blessing, their goods didn't leave the warehouse. The garment industry was New York's pride, a symbol of creativity and commerce. And quietly, Anthony Corallo had his hand wrapped around its throat. Construction followed naturally. The post-war boom was reshaping the city. Skyscrapers rose, highways expanded, housing projects spread across boroughs. It was a feeding frenzy of contracts and labor. And wherever there were contracts, there were unions. Anthony's influence seeped into construction unions, giving him the power to delay projects, inflate costs, or guarantee labor peace. Developers who wanted their buildings finished on time understood that a handshake with him was worth more than any blueprint. The genius of Anthony's strategy was that he never needed to appear in the headlines. He wasn't the man storming into offices with a pistol. He was the man whose absence could shut a city down. He built a system where businesses depended on his quiet approval, and unions bent naturally to his will. To the outside world, he was just another businessman. To those inside, he was the invisible hand guiding everything. There were moments when rivals tried to challenge that grip. Independent trucking outfits resisted paying tribute. Some believed they could break free from Mafia control, relying on their own drivers and their own contracts. It never lasted. Trucks broke down mysteriously. Tires were slashed. Shipments vanished into thin air. Workers refused to cross picket lines. The pressure was subtle at first, then crushing. Eventually, everyone paid. Not because Anthony screamed or threatened, but because he made noncompliance impossible. Union leaders who resisted often found themselves facing choices that weren't really choices. They could take envelopes and keep their positions, or they could hold out and watch their careers, and sometimes their lives, crumble. Many chose envelopes. Those who didn't rarely lasted long. Anthony didn't need to raise his voice. His network did the work for him, and soon, the labor world of New York revolved quietly around his approval. The money was staggering. Week after week, envelopes flowed in, steady, reliable income streams from industries too large to fail and too vulnerable to resist. For Anthony, it was never about the thrill of fast money. It was about building something permanent, something that couldn't be undone by a single arrest or a single shooting. He was creating an empire in plain sight, one hidden under the hum of trucks, the clatter of sewing machines, the clang of construction sites. And through it all, his discipline remained intact. He didn't flaunt wealth. He didn't boast. He lived modestly compared to other mobsters, careful not to draw attention. It was the Lucchese philosophy made flesh, power that thrived in silence, influence that grew stronger the less it was seen. Still, law enforcement was watching. The feds knew what was happening, but proving it was another matter. How do you prosecute silence? How do you pin down a man who never signs his name, never shouts a threat, never leaves fingerprints? They tried, again and again, to connect him to strikes, to extortion, to racketeering. But each time, the trail stopped just short of his door. Tony ducks, they grumbled, always ducking them, always one step ahead. For Anthony, Each failed case wasn't just survival. It was reinforcement. Every time he walked free, his legend grew. Businessmen saw him as untouchable. Union leaders recognized his authority. Rivals thought twice before challenging him. And his own family, the Lucchese organization, began to see him not just as an earner, but as a man destined for bigger things. The 1950s cemented his empire. Trucking routes bent under his control. The garment district became his playground. Construction sites rose or fell, depending on his approval. It wasn't just about money anymore. It was about influence that stretched into the city's very infrastructure. And Antonio Corallo, the quiet boy from East Harlem, had built it brick by brick without ever breaking the calm surface of his demeanor. But empires attract attention, and as Anthony's influence grew, so did the determination of those who wanted to break him. Prosecutors sharpened their tools. Federal agents built thicker files. Rivals whispered in corners. The empire he had built so carefully was strong, but it wasn't invisible anymore. For the moment, though, he remained untouchable. He was the man whose silence made industries tremble, the boss-in-waiting who had turned unions into weapons and businesses into tributaries. He was the architect of a shadow economy that fed on the very lifeblood of New York. And yet, as the decade closed, one question loomed larger than all others. How long could the quiet Don keep building without the walls finally closing in? Chapter 9. The Quiet Power Broker. The room fell silent the moment he entered. No one barked an order. No one slammed a fist on the table. Yet every man sitting there, businessmen, union delegates, soldiers of the family, straightened their posture, lowered their voices, and waited for the quiet figure to take his seat. Antonio Corallo didn't need noise to command a room. He carried authority the way some men carried pistols, close to the chest, always ready, never flaunted. And in those dimly lit backrooms, in the spaces where deals were made and the future of entire industries decided, he was becoming known by a new title, the Quiet Don. By the mid-1950s, his rise was undeniable. He had built an empire in trucking, sanitation, and construction, but what set him apart was not just the money he earned. It was the way he earned it. Other mobsters relished in power plays, making scenes, using violence as punctuation to every sentence. Anthony was different. He preferred to stay in the shadows, crafting influence through whispers, handshakes, and subtle pressure. He understood something fundamental. Blood on the streets drew cops and headlines. But a quiet deal in a back room lasted for years, invisible to the public, immune to scandal. Businessmen who dealt with him often walked away unsettled. They couldn't point to a threat he had made, couldn't recall a raised voice. Yet they felt cornered, as though every move had already been decided before they entered the room. Anthony had a way of framing choices, so they didn't feel like choices at all. He made cooperation look inevitable, like the tide rolling in. You didn't resist. You adapted. That style earned him respect within the Mafia. Violence had its place, of course. It always did. But men like Lucchese valued earners who could think long-term, who could keep the money flowing without triggering unnecessary wars. Anthony embodied that philosophy. He was loyal, disciplined, and above all, patient. In a world full of men eager to prove themselves with bullets, he proved himself with silence. And that made him indispensable. His influence spread beyond unions and contracts. Politicians began to recognize his name, not in public, not in newspapers, but in whispers at fundraisers and private dinners. City officials found themselves swayed by his allies, steered by his subtle presence. He wasn't a man who sought publicity. He was a man who understood that true power was exercised quietly, like a hand pressing gently but firmly on your shoulder. Inside the Lucchese family, Anthony's approach stood in stark contrast to the brash personalities that often dominated the underworld. Men who flaunted wealth, who shouted their authority, who left trails of violence behind them. They often burned out quickly, swallowed by prison or vendettas. Anthony's quiet power made him harder to target, harder to catch. He was building something sustainable, something that would endure. Even federal agents, frustrated at his ability to duck convictions, grudgingly acknowledged his discipline. They wanted him in handcuffs. They wanted him behind bars. But they also knew he wasn't reckless. He wasn't sloppy. He didn't hand them easy victories. For them, he was both a nightmare and a puzzle. A man too smart to fall into traps, too quiet to betray himself, too careful to leave evidence behind. This quiet power broker image was more than strategy. It was survival. Anthony had seen what happened to those who let ego lead them. Flashy men drew bullets. Reckless men drew indictments. He wasn't interested in either. He wanted to outlast them all. And the way to do that was by staying calm, measured, and always one step removed from the noise. But this calm exterior didn't mean he lacked ambition. Beneath the surface, Anthony's mind was always turning, always calculating. Every deal he struck, every relationship he nurtured, every silence he maintained, it all built toward a larger goal. He was laying groundwork for a legacy, a position not just as an earner, but as a leader. The Quiet Dawn wasn't just a title handed to him. It was one he was constructing, carefully, brick by brick, deal by deal. There was a moment in the late 50s that captured his style perfectly. A dispute had broken out between rival unions over control of trucking contracts tied to the garment district. The tension threatened to erupt into violence, with both sides arming their men, ready for war. Anthony stepped in. He didn't storm the meeting. He didn't raise his voice. He simply sat, listened, and then spoke with calm authority. Within an hour, the dispute was resolved. Both sides believed they had won, but in reality, Anthony had maneuvered them into giving him more control than before. It was chess disguised as conversation. This was his gift. He didn't win battles by force. He won them by making others believe they hadn't lost. And in a world defined by pride, that was a rare skill. The title of Quiet Dawn spread slowly, at first within the family, then among allies, and eventually even among rivals. They recognized that his lack of flash was not weakness, but strength. He wasn't loud because he didn't need to be. He wasn't violent because his influence did the work for him. And in a culture that often equated power with brutality, Anthony redefined it. Still, the nickname carried risk. Law enforcement noticed. The press noticed. They began to paint him as a new kind of mobster, one harder to pin down, harder to expose. And that attention, even if less dramatic than the headlines surrounding flashier figures, was still dangerous. The more his legend grew, the more determined the government became to crack it. But Anthony remained steady. He let others burn under the spotlight while he moved in the shadows. He preferred quiet dinners to public displays, private meetings to flashy clubs. He kept his circle small, his words fewer, his moves deliberate. In the Mafia, restraint was often mistaken for passivity. But Anthony's restraint was his weapon. He understood that real power didn't need to be loud. Real power didn't need to be seen. By the close of the decade, Anthony Corallo was more than just an earner. He was a power broker. He was the man who could settle disputes with a word, steer industries with a nod, and duck indictments with the ease of a man tying his shoes. His reputation as Tony Ducks made him feared by law enforcement, but his reputation as the Quiet Dawn made him respected, even admired, within the underworld. And yet, this quiet ascent carried with it a dangerous truth. The higher he climbed, the fewer places there were to hide. The law was adapting, learning, waiting for a way to break through his silence. Rivals, too, were watching, calculating how to position themselves if his luck ever ran out. For now, though, he thrived. He built his influence one whispered deal at a time, becoming the very embodiment of low-profile power. He was the man who didn't shout, didn't threaten, didn't boast, yet somehow always got what he wanted. But the quietest men often hold the loudest secrets. And in the years ahead, Anthony's silence would be tested in ways even he couldn't control. Chapter 10. The Commission Seat. The funeral was quiet, but the silence spoke louder than any eulogy. Black suits lined the pews, faces hardened not with grief, but with calculation. Tommy Lucchese, the small man with the sharp mind, The boss who had steered his family with cunning and restraint was gone. The year was 1967, and with his passing, the Lucchese family lost more than a leader. They lost the shield of a man whose presence had kept rivals at bay and law enforcement distracted. In the hushed whispers that followed, one question rose above all others. Who would take his place? Antonio Corallo sat among the mourners, his expression unreadable. For decades, he had been the student, the earner, the quiet figure in the background who had learned every lesson Lucchese had taught without ever drawing unnecessary attention. Now, as the casket was lowered, he knew the landscape was about to shift. Power never stayed still in the Mafia. It moved like water, always seeking the next vessel strong enough to contain it. And Anthony, patient as ever, was ready. But the succession wasn't immediate, nor was it simple. Into the vacuum stepped Carmine Tremonti, a man whose nickname, Mr. Garbage, hinted at his reputation in the sanitation rackets. Tremonti was older, cautious, and by all account a placeholder. He didn't have the vision of Lucchese, nor the quiet authority of Corallo. His leadership was tolerated but not respected. For Anthony, it was a lesson in what happened when power rested on age rather than strategy. During Tremonti's brief reign, the family wavered. Law enforcement pressure increased, and internal confidence declined. The man at the helm didn't have the strength to steer through storms, and everyone knew it. Anthony watched closely, keeping his own counsel, continuing to build influence without ever appearing too eager. He knew that in this world, the man who lunged at the throne often found himself buried before he sat on it. The trick was to wait, to endure, to let time and circumstance push you forward. And Tom did just that. In the early 1970s, Carmine Tremonti's health faltered, and the law closed in. In 1973, he was convicted on drug charges, despite the fact that he had little real control over the family by then. His fall opened the door for Anthony, who had been preparing quietly, deliberately, for years. When Corallo assumed leadership of the Lucchese family, it wasn't marked by fanfare. There were no grand announcements, no violent coups. It happened the way he did everything, quietly, efficiently, almost invisibly. But within the Mafia, everyone knew. The quiet Don had become the man at the top. Sitting at the commission table, the governing body of the five families, Anthony carried himself with the same calm demeanor he always had. He didn't need to prove himself with theatrics. His decades of discipline, his ability to duck convictions, his mastery of unions and industries, these were his credentials. Other bosses recognized him not as a man to underestimate, but as one to respect. His reputation as Tony Ducks, the man who slipped through the cracks of the law, now merged with his title as the Lucchese boss, giving him a dual aura of invincibility. In many ways, his rise was the natural evolution of everything he had learned under Lucchese. He kept the family low profile, focusing on industries that generated steady income without unnecessary violence. He maintained strong ties to unions, ensuring the family's grip on trucking and construction remained ironclad. And he cultivated political connections, understanding that in the modern era, influence in City Hall could be more valuable than 1,000 soldiers on the street. But the commission wasn't just a council of allies. It was a den of wolves, each boss guarding his own interests, each waiting for a sign of weakness in the others. Anthony's quiet nature served him well here. He wasn't the loudest voice in the room, but he was the one others listened to when disputes threatened to spiral. His calm presence, his ability to settle conflicts without escalating them, earned him a place of respect on the board that governed organized crime in New York. Yet leadership brought new dangers. With Lucchese gone and Tremonti out of the way, Anthony could no longer hide in the background. His name carried weight now, and with weight came attention. Law enforcement, frustrated for years by his ability to duck charges, redoubled their efforts. Rivals tested him, probing for cracks in his authority. Every decision carried greater stakes. The quiet man who once thrived in the shadows now stood in a place where every move was scrutinized. He handled it as he always had, with patience, discipline, and silence. He didn't lash out at rivals. He didn't draw unnecessary heat. Instead, he tightened his grip on the rackets he already controlled, ensuring a steady flow of money that kept his soldiers loyal and his family strong. He maintained a balance between intimidation and cooperation, ensuring that businessmen and union leaders saw him not as a reckless gangster, but as a man who could deliver stability. Still, the world outside was changing. The 1970s brought new pressures. Drug trafficking expanded, federal laws grew sharper, and prosecutors became more ambitious. The Mafia's old ways of staying invisible were being eroded by surveillance, wiretaps, and aggressive legal strategies. Anthony knew the ground beneath his feet was shifting, but for the moment, his quiet leadership kept the Lucchese family steady in turbulent times. By 1973, his seat on the commission was secure. He was no longer just Tony Ducks, the man who outsmarted the feds. He was Antonio Corallo, boss of the Lucchese family, a figure whose quiet influence shaped industries, unions, and politics across New York. His rise had been slow, deliberate, and disciplined, and now he stood among the most powerful men in organized crime. But power, no matter how quietly held, always casts a shadow. And as Anthony settled into his role, the forces that had chased him for decades, prosecutors, federal agents, rivals, began to circle once again, determined that this time, the quiet Don would not walk away unscathed. For now, though, he sat calmly at the commission table, his presence understated yet undeniable, a quiet storm at the heart of organized crime. And while the world around him braced for change, Antonio Corallo prepared to prove that silence, more than violence, was the ultimate weapon in the Mafia's arsenal. Chapter 11. Running the family like a business. The car crept slowly through the streets of Queens, headlights dimmed, the night air heavy with tension. Inside sat Antonio Corallo, not with soldiers brandishing guns, not with enforcers eager for violence, but with lieutenants who spoke in measured tones about contracts, shipments, and unions. This wasn't a war council. It was a board meeting, and at the head of it sat the quiet Don, running one of the most dangerous organizations in America with the precision of a corporate executive. By the mid-1970s, Anthony had settled fully into his role as boss of the Lucchese family. He didn't rule with chaos. He ruled with order. Secrecy, efficiency, and discipline defined his leadership. To him, the Mafia wasn't just a gang. It was an enterprise. And if he treated it like a business, it could outlast the feds, outsmart the rivals, and keep money flowing for decades. The difference was visible in every decision he made. Other bosses flaunted their power. They shouted in meetings, demanded loyalty with threats, and unleashed violence as a first resort. Anthony did the opposite. He kept his circle small, his words fewer, and his presence understated. Violence was a tool, but it was never the foundation. Money was. And to secure that money, he relied heavily on men he trusted to handle the details. Among them were Christopher Fornari, known as Christy Tick, and Vittorio Amuso, a younger, ambitious lieutenant. Christy Tick was a strategist, steady and calculating, able to manage operations with the same patience Anthony himself displayed. Amuso, meanwhile, had a sharper edge, more aggressive, but useful when pressure was needed. Together, they formed the backbone of Anthony's leadership. He delegated with precision, giving them authority to manage unions, trucking routes, and collections, while he focused on the bigger picture. In this structure, Anthony resembled less a traditional mob boss and more a CEO. He set policies, enforced discipline, and let his lieutenants handle execution. But unlike corporate executives, failure in this world carried a different price. Mistakes weren't measured in lost profits alone. They were measured in blood. And Anthony made sure everyone understood that. He didn't need to raise his voice to make the point. One look, one pause in conversation, was enough to remind his men that loyalty and competence were the only currencies that mattered. His secrecy was legendary. He rarely appeared in public meetings. He avoided wiretaps by keeping conversations vague, speaking in code, or simply saying nothing at all. He knew that every word could become evidence, every meeting a potential trap. Where others slipped, he stayed cautious. His silence was his shield, and it worked. The feds grew increasingly frustrated, describing him as a ghost who never left fingerprints. Efficiency was his second hallmark. Under his leadership, rackets didn't just survive, they flourished. Trucking companies bent easily, garment district businesses remained under control, and construction projects flowed through union channels he dominated. Every deal was designed to maximize profit while minimizing exposure. His men collected without causing scenes, negotiated without escalating to violence, and moved money with the precision of accountants. To businessmen and union leaders, Anthony wasn't a gangster in the way they imagined. He was something scarier, a businessman they couldn't refuse. He didn't need to scream or threaten. He made cooperation look logical, even necessary. A developer who signed with him wasn't bullied into compliance. He was persuaded that without Anthony, his project would stall, his costs would balloon, his future would unravel. It was intimidation disguised as inevitability. This approach built stability. Soldiers stayed loyal because they were paid. Associates remained cooperative because they profited. Even rivals often preferred negotiation with Anthony's crew over violent conflict, knowing that he brought order to situations that could otherwise spiral into chaos. The Quiet Don's empire was built not on fear alone, but on the recognition that his way worked. Yet behind the calm surface, there was always tension. Christy Tick handled disputes with his trademark composure, but he also carried the weight of ensuring Anthony's low-profile approach didn't unravel. Vic Amuso, younger and hungrier, sometimes pushed for harsher methods, testing the boundaries of Anthony's patience. Anthony balanced them both, understanding that leadership meant managing not just external threats, but internal ambition. He let his lieutenants stretch their wings but kept them tethered, reminding them subtly that the family's success depended on silence, not spectacle. It was this balance that earned him respect across the commission. Other bosses saw in him a man who could maintain stability without constant bloodshed. He wasn't weak, far from it. He was pragmatic. Violence cost money. Investigations cost money. But quiet deals, efficiently managed rackets, and disciplined soldiers, those made money. And in the end, money was the true language of power. The feds, of course, didn't see him as a businessman. They saw him as a target. His reliance on trusted lieutenants made it difficult to tie him directly to crimes. He was insulated, careful, shielded by layers of loyal men who took the risks while he reaped the rewards. For prosecutors, it was infuriating. They knew he was the boss, but proving it in court was like chasing smoke. Every time they thought they had him, the trail went cold. Every indictment fell apart. Tony Ducks lived up to his name, slipping through again and again. But Anthony knew better than to believe he was invincible. He had watched too many powerful men brought down by arrogance. His strategy was simple: stay quiet, stay efficient, and let others draw the spotlight. He didn't dine in public with celebrities. He didn't flaunt wealth with mansions or luxury cars. He lived comfortably but modestly, blending into the city like any other aging businessman. To the outside world, he looked ordinary. To those inside, he was untouchable. This illusion of ordinariness was perhaps his greatest weapon. Prosecutors wanted the dramatic mobster, the one they could parade before cameras as proof of their victories. Anthony denied them that satisfaction. He never played the role they expected. He never gave them the quote, the picture, the slip that could become evidence. Instead, he gave them nothing. Silence was his brand, and it worked. Still, leadership carried weight he could never ignore. Every envelope that reached his desk, every handshake deal struck in his name, every move his lieutenants made, it all came back to him. And though he trusted Christy Tick and Amuso, he knew that in this life, trust was fragile. Ambition was always waiting in the wings, ready to turn loyalty into betrayal. For now, the balance held. His lieutenants delivered, his soldiers earned, his empire thrived. But the cracks, small and subtle, were always there. By the late 70s, Anthony Corallo had transformed the Lucchese family into a disciplined, efficient operation that resembled a corporation more than a crime family. He was the CEO of Shadows, the quiet don whose word carried weight across industries, unions, and even politics. His reliance on trusted lieutenants gave him both strength and insulation, allowing him to focus on strategy while others handled the risk. But the higher the walls he built, the more determined his enemies became to climb them. The feds were learning new tricks, developing new tools, listening in places Anthony believed were safe. His discipline had kept him free for decades, but technology was changing the rules. And though he didn't know it yet, the same silence that had protected him would soon betray him. For now, though, he sat calmly at the head of his empire, running the family with the precision of a businessman, the patience of a chess master, and the silence of a ghost. And somewhere in the darkness, the first threads of a trap were already being woven, threads designed to catch even the quiet dawn. Chapter 12. The Jaguar Office. The leather seats creaked as the car doors shut, sealing the outside world behind glass and steel. The Jaguar purred softly, its engine humming like a lullaby, while the city's noise faded to a muffled backdrop. Inside, Anthony Corallo leaned back, cigar in hand, his eyes half hidden behind the brim of his hat. This wasn't just a ride through New York traffic. This was a boardroom on wheels, a fortress of secrecy where plans were whispered, strategies were shaped, and the future of an empire was decided. The Jaguar became legendary, not because it was flashy, but because of what it represented. To most men, a car was just transportation. To Anthony, it was insulation. The quiet don had always lived by rules of secrecy and caution. He believed walls had ears, bars had eyes, and phones were traps waiting to snap shut. But in his mind, the Jaguar was different. Surrounded by steel and motion, with trusted men in the seats beside him and a loyal chauffeur at the wheel, he thought he had created the one place the FBI could never touch. He was wrong. But in those years, before the truth revealed itself, the Jaguar was his sanctuary. Deals that shaped industries were discussed between red leather seats. Construction projects that would change the skyline were planned while the city blurred past the windows. Union negotiations, trucking routes, loan collections, they all passed through that moving office. Corallo didn't need skyscrapers or corner offices. He needed mobility, privacy, and the confidence that no one outside those doors would ever know what was said. His men called it the Jaguar office with respect, almost reverence. When you were summoned into that car, it wasn't just a drive. It was an audience with the boss. And you knew the words exchanged there could shape the next months, even years, of your life. Anthony rarely wasted breath. He asked questions, listened more than he spoke, and gave instructions in clipped sentences that left no room for misunderstanding. It fit perfectly with his philosophy of leadership. He didn't believe in loud proclamations or dramatic displays. He believed in subtlety, efficiency, and silence. The Jaguar became an extension of that style, a place where words floated in smoke and then vanished as the city swallowed them whole. No records, no paper trails, just conversations on the move. Yet even as he believed the car was safe, the FBI was watching. They knew his habits, his routes, the hours he spent circling neighborhoods while deals unfolded in the back seat. And in their frustration, they began to look at the Jaguar not as a shield, but as an opportunity. For years they had tried to crack Tony Ducks with arrests, indictments, and surveillance. Each time, he slipped free. But if they could pierce the walls of that moving office, if they could turn his sanctuary into evidence, they might finally cage the man who had eluded them for decades. For now, though, Corallo's confidence remained unshaken. He leaned back, puffed cigars, and carried on business as though the Jaguar was a confessional booth, protected by speed and steel. His lieutenants joined him, Christy Tick, steady and calculating, and Vic Amuso, younger and sharper, hungry to prove himself. Together, they mapped out the family's future, line by line, block by block. Every trucking contract, every sanitation route, every construction union, all of it passed through conversations in that car. Some nights, as the Jaguar rolled through Queens or the Bronx, the city lights flashing against its windows, Anthony reflected on how far he had come. From a boy on East Harlem streets, running errands in the shadows, to the head of a family whose reach stretched into every corner of New York. The car symbolized more than secrecy. It symbolized his journey. He had no need for lavish offices or public recognition. His empire lived in silence, and silence was enough. But silence can be deceiving. Every whisper in that Jaguar carried risk. Every strategy spoken aloud left a trail, invisible perhaps, but waiting to be uncovered. And though Anthony believed he had found the perfect hiding place, the truth was that no fortress is impenetrable. The FBI had time, resources, and a determination sharpened by years of frustration. They were patient hunters, and Anthony, for all his discipline, had unknowingly given them a target that moved on four wheels. For now, though, the Jaguar remained sacred ground. Men climbed in with fear in their hearts, unsure if they would emerge with a blessing or a curse. Businessmen agreed to terms they couldn't refuse. Union leaders nodded to demands they had no choice but to accept. The hum of the engine and the glow of dashboard lights became the backdrop to decisions that shaped the city's underground economy. Anthony's faith in that car was absolute. To him, it was untouchable, invisible, beyond the reach of the law. And that faith allowed him to speak more freely there than anywhere else. Perhaps too freely. Because even the quiet Don, the man who built his empire on silence, would learn that the one place he trusted most would one day betray him. Chapter 13. The Teamsters Connection. The Union Hall smelled of sweat, tobacco, and coffee gone stale from sitting too long in a dented pot. It looked like any other place where working men gathered, walls plastered with posters about wages and safety, voices rising in frustration about routes, hours, and pay. But hidden beneath the arguments about overtime was a deeper truth. The Teamsters Union wasn't just a collection of truck drivers. It was one of the most powerful institutions in America. And for men like Antonio Corallo, it wasn't just an opportunity. It was the perfect weapon. By the 1970s, Corallo had already mastered the art of controlling industries from the shadows. Trucking, construction, the garment district, all bent quietly under his will. But the Teamsters were different. With nearly 2 million members, they were a national powerhouse. Whoever controlled them didn't just influence a city block or a borough. They controlled the arteries of commerce across the entire country. Food, fuel, clothing, supplies, all of it passed through the hands of union drivers. If those hands stopped working, America stopped moving. And Corallo, the quiet Don, understood the weight of that leverage better than anyone. He wasn't alone. Ties between the Mafia and the Teamsters stretched back decades, woven into the very fabric of the labor movement. But Corallo's path into this world came through men like Anthony Provenzano, Tony Pro. Where Corallo was quiet, steady, and disciplined, Tony Pro was loud, brash, and combustible. A union boss with power that stretched across New Jersey, Tony Pro commanded loyalty from drivers and fear from rivals. Together, their connection became a pipeline. One man controlling the workers, the other controlling the industries that depended on them. The deals were simple in structure, complex in execution. Union leaders promised labor peace, ensuring that strikes never crippled the businesses that paid tribute. In return, envelopes thick with cash moved quietly from businessmen to the Mafia's coffers. Pension funds, meant to safeguard the futures of hardworking drivers, were siphoned off through loans and investments that lined the pockets of mob families. Every check signed in good faith by union men became another dollar, fueling an empire of racketeering. Corallo's genius was that he never had to raise his voice. While Tony Pro bellowed at meetings and made enemies with his temper, Corallo sat quietly, orchestrating from a distance. He didn't need to bully or threaten. He let union men believe they were making choices, when in reality, every path led back to him. The drivers thought they had secured better contracts. The businessmen thought they had avoided costly strikes. But in truth, both sides were paying into a system where Corallo held the strings. The money was staggering. Teamsters pension funds alone represented billions. And, through trusted intermediaries, chunks of that money flowed into construction projects, trucking companies, even casinos, ventures where the Mafia skimmed profits before a single customer ever walked through the door. For the average union member, the pension was a promise of retirement. For Corallo and his associates, it was a river of cash waiting to be diverted. Yet it wasn't just about money. It was about power. The threat of strike, whispered through the right channels, could bring a Fortune 500 company to its knees. The promise of labor peace, quietly negotiated, could guarantee steady income for years. Corallo wielded that influence like scalpel. He didn't cut recklessly. He applied pressure carefully, making sure no one bled too much, making sure the system kept running. A businessman who paid once would pay forever, convinced it was cheaper to stay on Corallo's good side than to test what life looked like on the other side. Federal investigators understood the significance of the Teamsters' infiltration. They saw it as the crown jewel of organized crime. But proving it was another story. Union meetings looked legitimate on paper. Contracts appeared above board. And Corallo himself was always insulated, never signing documents, never making overt threats. He let lieutenants and intermediaries handle the dirty work, while he sat in the Jaguar or behind closed doors, keeping his fingerprints off everything. The connection to Tony Pro added both strength and volatility. Provenzano's temper brought him into conflict with rivals, even sparking violent feuds that left bodies in their wake. For Corallo, this was a reminder of why his own style mattered. He could benefit from Tony Pro's raw influence over drivers, but he never let himself be dragged into the chaos. He was the calm eye at the center of the storm, profiting from the labor empire without being consumed by its public battles. Still, the dangers were real. The federal government had begun to recognize the Mafia's stranglehold on unions, and new laws gave them sharper tools to investigate corruption. The disappearance of Jimmy Hoffa in 1975 only heightened scrutiny, as the public demanded answers about how deeply organized crime had penetrated the Teamsters. Corallo watched carefully, adjusting his strategies, tightening his circle, making sure his name remained whispered, not shouted. Inside the family, his reputation as a quiet power broker only deepened. Soldiers admired his ability to turn unions into weapons without firing a shot. Rivals respected his restraint, recognizing that his influence reached further than theirs without the chaos that usually followed. And businessmen, caught between loyalty to their workers and fear of the Mafia, saw him as the inevitable solution to their problems. He was the man who could make trouble disappear, for a price. But every whisper carried risk. Pension loans left paper trails. Businessmen who grew resentful sometimes talked to investigators. Union leaders with loose lips created vulnerabilities. Corallo managed it all with discipline, but he knew the system wasn't invincible. The same unions that gave him strength could also expose him if the wrong man decided to talk. For now, though, the Teamsters connection was a pillar of his empire. It gave him reach far beyond New York, extending influence across the country. It gave him money that flowed steadily, invisibly, into his pockets. And it gave him power that no rival family could easily challenge. Still, in the back of his mind, Anthony Corallo understood a truth that haunted every Mafia boss. Nothing stayed hidden forever. The feds were patient. They were listening. They were learning. And one day, they would find a way to turn his silence against him. The Jaguar still rolled, its leather seats cradling whispered plans, its engine humming with secrets. The Teamsters still paid, their leaders shaking hands in smoky backrooms, their workers unaware that their futures were being gambled away. And Anthony Corallo, the quiet Don, still believed his discipline would protect him. But cracks were forming. Investigators were circling. Rivals were restless. And the same silence that had kept him safe for decades was slowly turning into a silence the law was desperate to break. Chapter 14. Friends in High Places. The envelope slid across the polished wood desk, thick with cash, its weight heavier than paper alone. The man on the other side of the desk didn't flinch. He had seen plenty of envelopes like this before. He didn't ask questions. He didn't need to. A nod was enough. With that single gesture, a union contract would be approved, a permit pushed through, an investigation quietly shelved. And Anthony Corallo, the quiet Don, would walk away knowing his empire had once again been shielded by the most powerful protection of all, friends in high places. For decades, Corallo understood what so many gangsters failed to learn. The gun could silence a man. Money could buy a night's peace. But influence, true influence, was what kept a family alive year after year. Influence meant politicians who looked the other way, cops who lost evidence, inspectors who missed violations, and judges whose rulings always seemed to lean in your favor. It was the invisible armor that allowed his rackets to thrive in plain sight. In New York, politics was as much a hustle as the streets. Campaigns cost money, and mobsters like Corallo had plenty of it. A discreet donation here, a fundraiser attended there, and suddenly, doors opened that had been locked before. Building inspectors skipped certain sites. Union officials were appointed with friendly ties. Licenses that normally took months appeared in weeks. It wasn't magic. It was money, influence, and the understanding that corruption wasn't an accident. It was part of the system. Corallo never bragged about these connections. He didn't boast of politicians in his pocket or cops on his payroll. That wasn't his style. He treated influence the way he treated violence, as a tool to be used sparingly, quietly, and with maximum effect. But make no mistake, those connections were everywhere. In City Hall, in union offices, in police precincts. He had built a web of allies, each one tied not by loyalty, but by dependency. Once a man took an envelope, he could never truly walk away. Law enforcement knew corruption existed, but proving it was nearly impossible. A politician could claim a donation was legitimate. An inspector could insist he simply didn't see a violation. A police captain could argue that evidence had been misplaced by accident. Everything had a veneer of plausibility, and Corallo thrived in that gray space. His genius wasn't just paying off men. It was paying them in ways that allowed them to pretend they were still clean. This shield allowed his rackets to flourish. Trucking companies that should have been investigated for extortion sailed through without scrutiny. Construction projects plagued with mob schemes proceeded without delay. Even sanitation contracts, riddled with overcharges, passed through the city bureaucracy unchallenged. The system wasn't broken. The system was working exactly as Corallo wanted it to. But influence came with risk. Every man on his payroll was a potential weak link, a man who could flip under pressure or grow greedy enough to demand more. Corallo managed this with the same patience he applied to everything else. He spread favors carefully, never relying too heavily on one man, always making sure replacements were waiting if someone fell. It was risk management, mob style, redundancy not in machines, but in people. There was one story whispered in FBI files about a police officer who stumbled too close to Corallo's operations. The officer filed a report that should have triggered a wider investigation. But the report vanished, filed under the wrong name, misplaced in the wrong drawer. Months later, the officer was reassigned. His career quietly stalled. No violence, no threats, just a career ended by silence and unseen hands. That was the power of friends in high places. Corallo's connections also stretched into the courts. Prosecutors who thought they had airtight cases watched them unravel in front of juries that always seemed hesitant. Judges issued rulings that tilted just enough in the defense's favor to cripple the government strategy. Over and over, indictments collapsed. And every collapse strengthened the legend of Tony Ducks. To the public, he was a mobster who defied the system. To those in the know, he was a man who had bent the system to his will. Yet for all his influence, Corallo never believed it was permanent. He had seen too many allies fall, politicians exposed in scandals, cops arrested in stings, judges retired under suspicion. Influence was powerful, but it was fragile. It had to be maintained, nurtured, replaced when necessary. He treated it like a garden, trimming the weeds, watering the roots, never letting it grow wild enough to collapse. The irony was that his greatest protection also became his greatest vulnerability. The more the government failed to convict him, the more determined they became to expose his network. Each failed trial fueled their obsession. They knew he had help, even if they couldn't prove it. They knew the system was tilted, even if they couldn't see who was pulling the strings. And in their frustration, they sharpened their tools, pushing for new laws, new surveillance tactics, new methods that would eventually pierce even the walls of corruption. Inside the family, Corallo's influence was seen as a strength unmatched by rivals. While other bosses waged bloody wars for territory, Anthony quietly expanded through contracts and politics. Soldiers respected him not just because he paid them, but because he kept them safe. They knew that with the quiet Don at the top, indictments rarely stuck, investigations fizzled, and trials ended with smiles instead of sentences. His silence and his friends had built a fortress around them all. But every fortress has cracks. As the 1970s gave way to the 80s, the FBI began to turn the tide. They realized that while money could silence men, technology could not be bribed. Wiretaps, bugs, and surveillance became their new weapons. Slowly, they shifted their focus from corrupted officials to hidden microphones, from compromised cops to relentless agents. Corallo still had his friends, but the ground beneath him was shifting. For now, though, he remained protected. His Jaguar rolled through the city streets, filled with smoke and strategy, while his allies in City Hall and precinct houses ensured his path stayed clear. He was the quiet Don, shielded by silence, insulated by power, untouchable because the very system meant to stop him was working for him. Yet, deep down, he must have sensed the truth. Influence could buy time, but not eternity. The friends in high places who had shielded him for decades could not protect him from the storm already brewing. Because while envelopes and nods had once been enough, the FBI was about to prove that even the quiet Don couldn't duck forever. Chapter 15. The Mafia Commission in the 1970s. The doors to the private club closed with a heavy thud, shutting out the world beyond. Inside, the air was thick with smoke, the kind that clung to suits and seeped into the walls. Around the table sat the men who ruled the underworld of New York, bosses of the five families, each carrying decades of blood, loyalty, and money on their shoulders. Voices were low, deliberate, their words carefully chosen. Every decision made in that room would ripple outward, shaping the city, the unions, the rackets, even the streets themselves. And among them sat Antonio Corallo, the quiet Don, calm and unreadable, his silence more powerful than any outburst. By the 1970s, the commission was the Mafia's governing council, a shadow government within a government. It existed to keep order between families, settle disputes, and approve ventures that could enrich everyone. Gambling, construction, narcotics, loan sharking, nothing moved on a grand scale without its blessing. The men who sat there weren't just mob bosses. They were power brokers with the ability to cripple industries or ignite wars. Corallo's place at that table was no accident. He had risen carefully, never rushing, never overreaching. His reputation for discipline and reliability made him an ideal commission member. Unlike hot-headed bosses who let pride or violence dictate their choices, Anthony carried himself with the steadiness of a man who thought 10 steps ahead. In meetings, he didn't dominate the conversation. He didn't need to. When he finally spoke, men listened, because his words carried the weight of silence behind them. The issues facing the commission in those years were as complex as any political body. Gambling was the bread and butter of organized crime, and everyone wanted a piece of it. Casinos in Las Vegas, bookmaking operations in New York, illegal card games in basements across the city, they all generated millions. But money that big also drew attention. Too much expansion could spark law enforcement crackdowns. Too little, and rivals outside the commission might seize opportunities. Corallo argued for balance. Quiet growth, careful expansion, and strict discipline to keep gambling operations profitable without inviting too much heat. Narcotics were more divisive. Some bosses saw drugs as a gold mine, fast cash that could dwarf the profits of gambling or unions. Others saw them as poison, a reckless trade that drew too much attention from police and politicians alike. Corallo stood with the cautious camp. To him, narcotics were chaos, flashy, dangerous, and unsustainable. He preferred steady rackets like construction and trucking, rackets that built long-term influence. But he also understood reality. If drugs were going to move, better that they moved under commission oversight than through outsiders who might destabilize everything. His stance was pragmatic. Limit exposure, keep profits, and avoid unnecessary wars. Disputes between families were another constant. Territory was the lifeblood of the Mafia, and every inch of it was contested. A loan shark operating in the wrong borough, a bookmaker encroaching on another's turf, a construction contract claimed by two different families. These disputes could spiral into bloodshed. The commission existed to stop that spiral. And here, Corallo's calm voice became invaluable. He was not a man to rush into vendettas. He reminded the others that violence was bad for business. Blood on the sidewalks meant headlines, and headlines meant investigations. Better to compromise, to split profits, to settle disputes quietly in backrooms rather than with guns. This role as mediator reinforced his reputation as the quiet Don. He wasn't the kind of boss who demanded the spotlight or sought to dominate his peers. He was the kind who ensured everyone left the table with something, even if no one left fully satisfied. It was diplomacy by subtraction, taking just enough heat out of every argument to keep the system running. But the commission was never a place of pure cooperation. It was a den of predators, each boss watching the others, each waiting for weakness. Corallo's strength was that he gave them none. His caution meant he rarely stumbled. His patience meant he never appeared desperate. And his silence meant no one ever really knew what he was thinking until he revealed it. That aura of unreadability kept rivals from challenging him too directly. Outside those meetings, the decisions made at the commission table shaped entire industries. A nod from the bosses could greenlight a massive construction project with mob-control contractors. A shake of the head could doom a rival's expansion into gambling. And in the shadows, politicians and businessmen who thought they ran New York were in reality dancing to tunes written in smoke-filled rooms like these. Corallo thrived in this world because he saw the commission not just as a council of criminals, but as a corporation's board of directors. Each family was a shareholder, each racket a department, and every decision a matter of maximizing profit while minimizing exposure. He approached it like business, not theater. And in the world of organized crime, that made him dangerous. Still, danger lurked at every corner. Federal prosecutors were beginning to recognize the commission's true role. For decades, they had treated mob families as isolated gangs. Now they were piecing together that the bosses met, coordinated, and ran their empire like executives. The FBI began targeting the commission itself, convinced that if they could prove its existence, they could dismantle the Mafia at its roots. Corallo knew the risk, but he trusted in his discipline and his silence. He believed his words, spoken in backrooms, would never find their way into courtrooms. For the moment, that belief held. The 1970s rolled on, and Corallo continued to steer his family with caution. He played his part at the commission table, guiding decisions on gambling, tempering expansion into narcotics, and preventing disputes from exploding into wars. His low-profile leadership kept the Lucchese family strong, stable, and profitable. Soldiers respected him, rivals feared his patience, and allies trusted his judgment. But every meeting, every whispered word, every nod at that table carried the seeds of future danger. The government's eyes were narrowing. Wiretaps, surveillance, informants, tools that had once seemed clumsy were becoming sharper. And the same discipline that had protected Corallo for decades was about to be tested in ways even he could not control. For now, though, he sat calmly among the bosses, smoke curling in the air, his presence quiet but undeniable. He was the quiet Don, the man who spoke softly while others shouted, the man who turned silence into power. And outside those closed doors, the FBI was already plotting how to tear that silence apart. Chapter 16. The Lucchese family's golden era. The cranes dotted the New York skyline like steel giants, their arms sweeping back and forth over half-finished towers. Beneath them, men in hard hats labored, trucks rumbled, and concrete poured. To the public, it looked like progress, a city growing taller, faster, stronger. But beneath the dust and the noise, another reality pulsed through those construction sites. Every paycheck, every shipment of steel, every truck delivering materials was touched by unseen hands. And at the center of it all sat Antonio Corallo, the quiet Don, orchestrating an empire that had never been stronger. By the late 1970s and into the early 80s, the Lucchese family entered what many would call its golden era. The family was flush with money, its influence woven into the very fabric of the city. Construction sites, trucking depots, waste disposal companies, and union halls all fell under its control. It wasn't a flashy empire built on shootouts or headline-grabbing heists. It was a quiet stranglehold, a slow squeeze that turned New York itself into a machine that fed the family's pockets. Construction was the crown jewel. No building rose in Manhattan without the Mafia's blessing. Developers paid for peace, for materials to arrive on time, for laborers to show up without problems. The Lucchese family, through its grip on unions, ensured that projects ran smoothly, or didn't run at all. A strike could shut down a skyscraper in a single day. Delays meant millions lost. And for the price of an envelope, those problems could disappear. Corallo understood the leverage of time. In construction, every day cost money, and he made sure developers knew that the only way to keep those days on schedule was to stay on his good side. Trucking was no less powerful. By controlling trucking companies and unions, the Lucchese family didn't just move goods. They dictated who got deliveries and when. Rival businesses that resisted paying tribute suddenly found their shipments delayed, their merchandise lost, their routes mysteriously blocked. Loyal businesses, on the other hand, saw their trucks glide through the city without a hitch. The system wasn't chaos. It was order. Anthony's order. He transformed trucking from a blue-collar trade into a tool of influence, turning every delivery into a reminder of his quiet authority. Waste disposal was another empire in itself. New York produced mountains of trash every day, and someone had to move it. The Lucchese family made sure that someone always answered to them. Garbage routes became rackets, contracts secured through intimidation and bribes. If a company refused to pay, trash piled up outside their buildings until the smell alone forced them to reconsider. Controlling waste wasn't glamorous, but it was steady, reliable money. And Corallo understood that reliability was more valuable than spectacle. Unions tied everything together. Teamsters, construction workers, sanitation crews, all were bound by leadership that was either loyal to the Mafia or terrified into submission. Through those unions, Corallo didn't just control labor. He controlled industries. He turned collective bargaining into collective extortion, making sure every contract signed in New York carried the fingerprints of the Lucchese family. What set this era apart was how smoothly it all ran. Violence still lurked in the background, but it was rarely necessary. The threat of disruption, a strike, a delayed shipment, an uncollected trash pile, was enough to keep businesses compliant. Corallo's genius was making extortion look like protection. To the businessmen who paid him, he wasn't the threat. He was the solution. Pay, and your problems vanish. Refuse, and the city itself seemed to turn against you. The money was staggering. Tens of millions flowed steadily into the family's coffers, not from flashy crimes, but from industries too vital to resist. Construction delays, trucking disruptions, sanitation chaos. These were problems no businessman could afford. Corallo made sure they understood that the cost of his help was far less than the cost of his absence. Inside the family, morale was high. Soldiers were paid regularly, lieutenants had freedom to run their own rackets, and loyalty was rewarded. Under Corallo, the Lucchese family was seen as one of the most stable, disciplined of the five families. There were no public wars, no reckless bosses drawing attention. It was a machine, efficient and quiet, humming along in the shadows while the city above celebrated its growth. But beneath the calm surface, the pressure was building. Federal investigators had begun to connect the dots. They saw that the Mafia's grip on construction, trucking, and waste disposal wasn't just rumor. It was systemic corruption that drained billions from the economy. Prosecutors in Manhattan and Brooklyn, backed by an increasingly aggressive FBI, made the Mafia their prime target. The golden era, though rich and powerful, was also gilded with cracks. Corallo knew this. He had survived too long to believe any empire was invincible. But his discipline, his silence, his reliance on trusted lieutenants had carried him through decades of danger. He believed those same qualities would protect him now. The Jaguar still served as his mobile office, unions still bent to his will, and his soldiers still whispered about his uncanny ability to duck the law. To them, he was untouchable. Still, whispers of change crept in. Technology was evolving. Wiretaps were sharper. Surveillance was more advanced. The FBI no longer relied solely on corrupt cops or shaky witnesses. They had begun to listen in places Corallo believed were safe. The golden era glowed bright, but shadows of its eventual fall stretched long across the horizon. For now, though, the Lucchese family thrived. Construction cranes continued to rise. Trucks continued to roll. Garbage continued to vanish from curbs. Every corner of the city hummed with activity, and behind it all was the quiet dawn, orchestrating an empire with the patience of a chess master and the silence of a ghost. But golden eras never last forever. And as the 80s dawned, Anthony Corallo's empire, vast, profitable, and disciplined, was about to collide with a government that had finally found the tools to strip away the silence he had built his life upon. Chapter 17: Federal Pressure Mounts. The papers on the prosecutor's desk were stacked high, but one file sat on top, its label scrawled in thick black ink: Corallo. The quiet dawn. Tony Ducks. For years, agents had chased him, prosecutors had cursed his name, and judges had watched cases collapse in front of them. But now, in the late 1970s, the mood in federal offices across New York was changing. The government wasn't just reacting anymore. They were hunting, and the man they wanted most sat quietly in his Jaguar, still convinced the law could never reach him. The climate had shifted. America was tired of headlines about mafia bosses walking free. Senators demanded action. U.S. attorneys wanted victories that would define their careers. And at the center of this new campaign was a weapon the mob had underestimated: RICO. The Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, passed in 1970, was designed to do what decades of indictments had failed to accomplish. Instead of chasing individual crimes, prosecutors could now paint a picture of an entire criminal enterprise. For the first time, the law recognized that the Mafia wasn't just a loose collection of crooks. It was an organization with rules, hierarchy, and continuity. And if the law could prove you were part of it, every crime connected to it became yours. For men like Corallo, this was a nightmare. He had survived by staying insulated, by letting lieutenants take the risks while he stayed in the shadows. But RICO cut through insulation. It didn't matter if Anthony hadn't personally threatened a businessman or carried a gun. If his family had done it, and he benefited, the law said he was guilty. Guilt by leadership, guilt by association, guilt by belonging to the very world he had spent a lifetime perfecting. The FBI threw itself into this new strategy with ruthless focus. Teams of agents worked around the clock, mapping the structure of the 5 families, identifying soldiers, capos, and bosses. Wiretaps sprouted like weeds, in bars, in restaurants, in union offices. Informants, once considered unreliable, were cultivated with care, their whispers stitched together into a tapestry of evidence. The Bureau wasn't just collecting isolated stories anymore. They were building narratives, each thread connecting to the next, until the entire Mafia web began to take shape. Corallo knew the pressure was mounting. He had seen the indictments piling up against rivals. Bosses who once seemed untouchable were suddenly on trial, facing charges that tied them not to one act of extortion, but to decades of organized crime. The air grew tense in commission meetings. Conversations were shorter, coded, filled with the weight of paranoia. Every man at the table wondered how close the government was, and whether one of their own might already be compromised. The quiet Don responded the only way he knew how, with discipline. He tightened his circle even further, relying only on men he trusted completely. He shifted meetings away from predictable haunts, relying more heavily on his Jaguar office, still believing it was safe from prying ears. He spoke less, demanded more, and reminded his lieutenants constantly that silence was survival. But the ground was shifting beneath him, whether he admitted it or not. Prosecutors, too, were changing. No longer were they satisfied with short prison terms or flashy arrests that led nowhere. They wanted dismantling convictions, life sentences that would cripple entire families. Young, ambitious attorneys studied the Mafia like generals studying an enemy army. They didn't just want soldiers. They wanted bosses. They wanted commission members. They wanted men like Antonio Corallo. For the FBI, it was personal. Years of frustration had built into obsession. Agents swapped stories of cases that had collapsed, of witnesses who vanished, of juries that wavered under pressure. They called him Tony Ducks because he ducked everything they threw at him. But in hushed conversations inside bureau offices, the nickname was no longer spoken with resignation. It was spoken with challenge. They would be the ones to finally clip his wings. Meanwhile, in the streets, Corallo's empire still thrived. Construction sites bent to his will, trucking routes flowed through his hands, and unions still answered his calls. To the average soldier, nothing had changed. They saw money flowing, businesses paying, and the boss as untouchable as ever. But the storm clouds gathering above them were invisible to most. Only Corallo, with his decades of survival, felt the weight of the air shifting. The danger of RICO was that it turned time itself into a weapon. Every crime the Lucchese family had committed for years could be bundled together into one massive case. What once seemed like isolated charges, a hijacking here, an extortion there, became part of a larger pattern. The government didn't need to catch Anthony in the act. They just needed to prove he was at the top of the pyramid, benefiting from everything below. And that, for the first time, was possible. Still, Corallo had confidence. His friends in high places had shielded him before. Corruption still greased the wheels of politics and law enforcement. He believed in his discipline, his silence, his ability to duck. And for the moment, it worked. Cases dragged on, indictments stalled, and the quiet Don walked free again and again. To the outside world, it looked like nothing had changed. But inside FBI offices, the files grew thicker. The agents grew bolder. And the law, sharpened by RICO, waited patiently for its moment. There was a sense of inevitability creeping in, though no one dared say it aloud. The Mafia's golden era, its peak of power in the 70s and early 80s, carried within it the seeds of its downfall. The very visibility of its influence, the skyscrapers, the unions, the money, made it impossible to ignore. And Anthony Corallo, for all his quiet discipline, had become too important, too central, too symbolic to escape forever. The Jaguar still rolled. The union still bent. The money still flowed. But the silence that had once been his shield was becoming the very thing the FBI was determined to break. For now, the quiet Don remained free, his empire intact, his reputation unshaken. But somewhere in the shadows, the Bureau was listening, waiting, closing in. And the question lingered like smoke in a closed room. How much longer could Tony Ducks keep ducking before the law finally clipped him for good? Chapter 18. The Jaguar bugged. The hiss of static gave way to voices. The sound was faint at first, muffled by leather seats and the hum of an engine, but then it sharpened. Clear words. Recognizable names. Plans spoken with the kind of confidence that only comes when men believe no one is listening. In that moment, Inside an FBI office crowded with agents wearing headphones, the silence of Anthony Corallo finally broke. The Jaguar, his sanctuary, his moving fortress of secrecy, had been bugged. It was one of the most daring surveillance operations in FBI history. Corallo had long believed the car was untouchable. He avoided restaurants, clubs, and homes for sensitive business. He trusted nothing but those four wheels. To him, the Jaguar was safer than any office. But the Bureau had learned his pattern. They knew he spent hours there with his chauffeur, talking strategy with trusted lieutenants. They knew if they could penetrate that space, they could capture not just conversations, but the inner workings of an entire crime family. The bug was planted with surgical precision. Agents tracked the car, mapped its routes, and waited for the moment to strike. When it came, they moved quickly, slipping devices into the Jaguar's interior, hidden so cleverly that even the most paranoid inspection would have missed them. For years, the FBI had played catch-up, chasing shadows. Now, for the first time, they had the upper hand, and the recordings did not disappoint. What poured through those wires was a revelation. Corallo spoke with a calm, measured tone, but the content was explosive. He discussed union control, construction rackets, waste disposal contracts, and payoffs to politicians. He spoke of commission business, disputes between families, gambling operations, even narcotics policy. His lieutenants chimed in, offering details, complaints, and strategies. The Jaguar became a classroom for agents, a daily lecture on the mechanics of organized crime delivered straight from the mouths of its leaders. For prosecutors, it was gold. For decades, they had suspected, alleged, and argued about the Mafia's structure. Now they had proof. Not rumors. Not reluctant witnesses. Actual recordings of bosses discussing their empire in real time. It was like finding blueprints to a fortress that had seemed impenetrable. Corallo, for all his discipline, had been undone by trust. He trusted the Jaguar. He trusted the motion of the car, the barrier of glass, the loyalty of his driver. He believed he had built a bubble the FBI could never pierce. That belief gave him confidence, and that confidence loosened his tongue. The very silence that had once shielded him became a trap. Inside FBI offices, agents leaned closer to the speakers, listening as decades of frustration finally melted into triumph. They heard Corallo name names, outline payments, describe how politicians were bought and how unions were bent. They heard commission strategy discussed as casually as baseball scores. For the Bureau, it was vindication, proof that patience, technology, and persistence could finally break through the Mafia's code of silence. For Corallo, the danger was invisible. He continued to ride in the Jaguar, puffing cigars, speaking calmly, believing his world was secure. His lieutenants joined him, equally confident, never suspecting that every word was being captured. The irony was cruel. The very space he thought was untouchable had become the government's greatest weapon against him. The recordings piled up. Hours upon hours of conversations, each one another nail in the coffin of secrecy. Prosecutors began to weave them into cases, connecting dots, building narratives that stretched from New York construction sites to union halls across the country. For the first time, Rico had teeth sharpened by the voices of the men it targeted. Yet Corallo's confidence remained. He had ducked so many cases before that he believed he could duck this one too. He trusted his lawyers, his allies, his discipline. But this time, it wasn't just paperwork and witnesses. This time, it was his own voice. And no lawyer, no corrupt official, no envelope of cash could make that vanish. The Jaguar still rolled, carrying him through city streets, past skyscrapers his family had helped build, past trucks his men controlled, past garbage routes that paid tribute to his empire. On the surface, nothing had changed. The money flowed, the family thrived, the quiet dawn remained untouchable. But in FBI vaults, his words were locked away, waiting. Words that would soon echo not in the hum of an engine, but in the silence of a courtroom, played for juries who would finally hear what the government had chased for decades. For now, Anthony Corallo lived in the comfort of ignorance, still believing in the sanctity of his Jaguar office. But the walls were closing in, and this time his silence would not save him. The question now was not if the FBI would strike, but when. Chapter 19. The commission case begins. The courtroom was packed, the air charged with a tension that felt electric. Rows of journalists clutched notepads, their pens twitching in anticipation. Federal agents filled the benches, their eyes fixed on the men in tailored suits, now sitting where ordinary criminals usually sat. But these were no ordinary men. These were bosses, the very architects of New York's underworld. And at the center of it all was Anthony Corallo, the Quiet Don, a man who had spent decades ducking the law, now staring at a trial unlike any he had ever faced. The year was 1985. For months, federal prosecutors had worked in secrecy, weaving together the case they believed would finally cripple the Mafia at its core. It wasn't about one hijacking, one extortion, or one murder. It was about proving the existence of something the Mafia had always denied: the Commission, a governing body that coordinated the five families, dividing territory, approving murders, and controlling rackets worth billions. For years, it had been whispered about, suspected, theorized. Now, the government was ready to drag it into the light. And their star evidence came from Jaguar. Those tapes, the hours of Corallo's calm voice floating through cigarette smoke and city traffic, had become the cornerstone of the prosecution's case. On them, he spoke of labor rackets, of construction deals, of influence bought and sold like currency. He spoke of the commission itself, confirming with his own words what the FBI had long tried to prove. To prosecutors, it was like finding the Mafia's constitution written out loud. The man leading this crusade was Rudy Giuliani, then the U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of New York. Ambitious, relentless, and determined to make his name, Giuliani saw the commission case as more than just law enforcement. He saw it as a chance to rewrite history, to prove that no one, not even the Quiet Don, could outsmart the federal government forever. He assembled a team of prosecutors and agents who lived and breathed the case, poring over transcripts, analyzing conversations, piecing together a puzzle that stretched back decades. For Corallo, it was surreal. He had always believed his discipline, his silence, his insulation would protect him. But now, in the very heart of the courtroom, it was his own voice that echoed back at him. Played for the jury, the recordings were damning. Calm, measured words that carried the weight of conspiracy, strategy, and corruption. He didn't rant. He didn't threaten. But the very normalcy of his tone made it worse. He spoke of unions and contracts with the ease of a businessman, revealing how deeply organized crime had embedded itself in the city's foundation. The trial was a spectacle. Each morning, the press swarmed the courthouse, eager to capture images of bosses who had long avoided cameras. Headlines screamed of the Mafia's secret government. For the public, it was confirmation of what movies and whispers had long suggested, that the Mafia wasn't just gangs on street corners, but an empire run like a corporation, with a board of directors called the Commission. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was heavy. Prosecutors laid out charts, diagrams, and transcripts, showing the jury how the five families weren't rivals alone but collaborators, sharing profits, avoiding wars, and settling disputes through quiet meetings and backrooms. They painted Corallo not as a lone gangster, but as part of a governing council that touched every corner of New York commerce. For the jurors, it was dizzying. They weren't just listening to stories of violence or shakedowns. They were being asked to see the Mafia as an institution, an invisible shadow government that operated parallel to their own. And every time Corallo's voice filled the courtroom, calm and certain, it became harder to deny. Corallo sat quietly through it all, his face unreadable. He had always trusted his composure to carry him through trials. But this was different. This wasn't one charge he could duck. This was a narrative, a sweeping indictment of his entire life's work. He knew the risk. If the prosecutor succeeded, it wouldn't just mean prison. It would mean the dismantling of everything he had built. The defense fought back, of course. Lawyers argued that the tapes were taken out of context, that casual conversations were being twisted into grand conspiracies. They insisted the commission was a myth, a fabrication by ambitious prosecutors eager for headlines. But the recordings had a weight that arguments couldn't shake. The jury could hear the voices themselves, unfiltered, undeniable. Still, Corallo clung to hope. He had ducked so many times before. Prosecutors had boasted of airtight cases, only to watch them collapse. Juries had wavered, evidence had crumbled, witnesses had faltered. Perhaps this, too, would end the same way. Perhaps his silence, his discipline, his reputation as Tony Ducks would carry him through one more storm. But deep down, he must have felt it, that this trial was different. The sheer scope of it, the historic ambition behind it, the determination of the prosecutors who saw it as more than just a case but a crusade. The commission trial wasn't about one man or one family. It was about rewriting the balance of power between the Mafia and the government. And the government wasn't backing down. As the trial stretched on, tension mounted. Prosecutors rolled out witnesses, FBI agents, recordings, and charts that mapped out the Mafia's empire like a corporation's org chart. They spoke of billions skimmed from construction, of unions corrupted, of waste disposal monopolized. They painted a picture of an invisible government that had ruled New York for decades, and they put Antonio Corallo squarely in the middle of it. The bosses sitting beside him, men from other families, equally proud, equally disciplined, shifted in their seats as the walls closed in. For decades, they had ruled with impunity, believing themselves untouchable. Now, they sat as defendants in a courtroom, their power reduced to whispers among lawyers. Outside, the city watched with fascination. For the public, it was a glimpse into a secret world, one that had shaped their lives in ways they had never seen. For the Mafia, it was a reckoning. And for Corallo, it was the moment his silence could no longer protect him. The trial became the stage where his entire life was placed under a microscope. His decades of discipline, his quiet power, his belief in invisibility, all of it was now evidence against him. And as the prosecutors pressed on, it became clear that this time there would be no ducking. Still, the verdict had not yet been read. The jury had not yet spoken. And in those tense days, as evidence piled high and recordings echoed through the courtroom, one question lingered like a shadow over the quiet dawn. Would Tony Ducks escape again? Or had the government finally built a net even he couldn't slip through? Chapter 20, Indictment of the Commission. The knock came early, a sharp crack against the quiet of the morning. By the time the door swung open, federal agents were already pushing through, their jackets marked with bold yellow letters, their faces set with determination. For years, Antonio Corallo had ducked raids like this. For years, he had walked out of police stations untouched, his lawyers smirking at reporters. But this time was different. This time, the papers in the agent's hands carried a weight no man at his level had ever faced before. They were indictments, not just for him, but for the very foundation of the Mafia itself. The year was 1985. Across New York, the headlines screamed of history in the making. The government had moved not against one family, not against one boss, but against the entire commission. It was a strike designed to decapitate organized crime, to prove that the shadow government of the five families was not untouchable. And at the top of the list was the Quiet Dawn. Alongside him were other giants of the underworld: Anthony Fat Tony Salerno of the Genovese family, Carmine Persico of the Colombos, Paul Castellano of the Gambinos. Names that had ruled the city for decades, now reduced to defendants in a case that promised to rewrite history. The indictment was sweeping. It accused the bosses of running their families like a criminal board of directors, controlling gambling, labor rackets, construction, and waste disposal. It alleged decades of extortion, fraud, and corruption, all tied together under the structure of the commission. For the first time, the government wasn't satisfied with nibbling at the edges. They were going for the heart. Corallo read the charges with the same calm expression he carried into every courtroom. But beneath that calm, there had to be weight. He knew what Rico meant. He knew that every word captured in his Jaguar, every whispered deal, every nod at the commission table, could now be used against him. This wasn't about ducking one case or outlasting one witness. This was about the government pulling decades of his life into the light, threading them together into one giant narrative he couldn't escape. The arrests were carried out like a show of force. Cameras flashed as bosses were led in handcuffs, their expensive suits wrinkled, their eyes shielded behind dark glasses. The public devoured the images. For years, the Mafia had been myth and rumor, a force whispered about in barbershops and portrayed on movie screens. Now, the men who had seemed larger than life were suddenly small, lined up in courtrooms, reduced to mugshots. For the government, it was vindication. Rudy Giuliani stood before microphones, declaring that the Mafia's ruling council was finished. He painted the case not as just another trial, but as a turning point in American history, proof that no man, no matter how disciplined, no matter how insulated, was beyond the reach of the law. His words struck like a challenge, a warning to every mobster still clinging to power. For Corallo, it was something else entirely. He had always believed in patience, in silence, in discipline. Those qualities had carried him through raids, trials, and investigations. They had made him Tony Ducks, the man who could slip past the law again and again. But now, as he sat in court surrounded by other bosses, he must have felt the enormity of what he faced. This wasn't a single case he could duck. This was history, and history had a way of leaving no escape. The indictment rattled the underworld. Soldiers whispered about what would happen next. Some feared the end of the commission altogether. Others believed it was just another test, one the bosses would survive as they always had. But uncertainty spread like smoke. If the government could take down men like Corallo and Castellano, what protection did anyone else have? The trial loomed like a storm on the horizon. Prosecutors prepared mountains of evidence, much of it pulled straight from Corallo's beloved Jaguar. Hours of recordings would soon play in open court, stripping away the secrecy that had defined the Mafia for generations. Every conversation, every strategy session, every calm admission would echo not in the safety of leather seats, but in the silence of a jury box. The quiet Don remained composed. He met with lawyers, reviewed transcripts, and carried himself with the same steady patience that had defined his life. He didn't rant or rave. He didn't lash out. If he felt fear, he buried it deep. His strength had always been his ability to remain calm when others panicked. But even he had to know this time was different. The indictment of the commission was more than a legal battle. It was a cultural moment. It was the government announcing that the myth of Mafia invincibility was over. It was the public seeing, for the first time, that the men who had shaped their city's skyline and economy through fear and silence were not gods but defendants. And yet, for all the headlines and all the triumph of prosecutors, the outcome was not yet written. Trials were unpredictable. Juries could be swayed. Evidence could falter. Corallo had ducked so many times before, and deep down, part of him must have believed he could do it again. The nickname Tony Ducks had carried him through decades of battles. Perhaps it still had one more miracle left. But as the case prepared to unfold, as the bosses were marched into courtrooms under the gaze of cameras, one truth hung over them all. The government had never come this close, never struck this hard, never aimed this high. For the first time in his long, disciplined life, Anthony Corallo faced a storm that even his silence might not survive. And the verdict of history waited just ahead. Chapter 21. Inside the Trial. The courtroom fell into silence as the tape machine clicked on. A faint hiss, then the unmistakable hum of an engine, followed by calm, measured voices. The jurors leaned forward. The press scribbled furiously. And the bosses, men who had ruled New York from the shadows for decades, sat stone-faced, listening to their own words echo back at them. It was the 1985 Commission trial, the government's most ambitious strike against organized crime. And for Anthony Corallo, it was the day his Jaguar betrayed him. Each morning, the courthouse became a theater. Reporters camped outside, flashing cameras at the motorcades of lawyers and defendants. Federal marshals escorted the bosses through metal detectors and into a room where the Mafia's myth of invincibility was slowly being dismantled. The defendants sat in a line, their suits pressed, their expressions blank masks of defiance. Corallo was there, calm as ever, his silence unbroken, even as evidence piled high against him. The trial was unlike anything the city had ever seen. For months, prosecutors laid out their case, not as a series of individual crimes, but as a sweeping story of a shadow government called the Commission. Charts showed the 5 families as branches of one organization. Testimony described the hierarchy: bosses at the top, captains below, soldiers carrying out orders. And then came the tapes, the crown jewel of the FBI's work. On those recordings, Corallo's voice drifted through the static, discussing labor rackets, payoffs, and commission decisions. He spoke of union control, of construction contracts, of how disputes between families were settled without blood. To the jury, it was shocking. These weren't vague rumors or Hollywood exaggerations. These were the men themselves, calmly explaining how New York was bent to their will. The defense tried to fight back. Lawyers argued the tapes were taken out of context, that idle talk was being twisted into conspiracy. They painted their clients as businessmen, victims of overzealous prosecutors desperate for headlines. They dissected transcripts line by line, insisting that nothing on them proved criminal intent. But the recordings carried a weight arguments couldn't shake. Jurors could hear the words themselves. They could hear the calm certainty in Corallo's voice. And no amount of spin could erase the sound of a boss explaining how the world worked in his orbit. Day after day, the trial unfolded like a chess game, each move carefully calculated. Prosecutors unveiled witnesses, former mobsters turned informants, union officials who admitted to payoffs, businessmen who confessed to making deals they couldn't refuse. The defense countered with sharp cross-examinations, attacking credibility, planting seeds of doubt. It was a war fought not with bullets, but with words, each side battling for the jury's belief. But the weight of the case was undeniable. This wasn't just about one family or one crime. It was about proving that the Mafia operated as a corporation of crime, with rules, meetings, and strategies. And every time Corallo's Jaguar tapes played, that argument grew stronger. The courtroom wasn't just hearing evidence. It was hearing the Mafia itself, unmasked. Outside, the city buzzed with fascination. The press covered every detail, from the suits the bosses wore to the way they sat, stoic and silent. Headlines declared the end of an era. Commentators debated whether the government could finally topple men who had seemed untouchable for so long. The spectacle turned bosses into reluctant celebrities, their faces splashed across front pages, their names whispered in households that had never before paid attention to the underworld. Inside the courtroom, though, the mood was darker. The weight of history pressed on everyone. Jurors knew they were part of something monumental. Prosecutors carried the burden of decades of failure, determined not to let this case slip away. And the bosses, men used to commanding rooms with a glance, were reduced to defendants, powerless as strangers weighed their futures. Corallo sat with the same calm patience he always had. He whispered to his lawyers, took notes, and watched the proceedings without visible panic. He had survived so much before. Indictments had come and gone. Trials had collapsed. Witnesses had vanished. Perhaps he believed this, too, would pass. But even he must have felt the difference. This wasn't a single case. This was the culmination of years of investigation, the government's grand design to pull down the Mafia's ruling council. And this time, the evidence wasn't built on shaky testimony. It was built on his own words. The defense tried to humanize the bosses, portraying them as family men, businessmen, even victims of unfair targeting. They argued that the government was inventing a grand conspiracy out of normal conversations, turning ordinary associations into criminal enterprises. But the prosecutors countered with relentless precision, showing how each conversation fit into a larger pattern, how each deal, each payoff, each nod at the commission table revealed a system of organized crime. The tension built as the weeks turned into months. The trial stretched on, grinding down defendants, lawyers, and jurors alike. The evidence piled higher. The tapes played longer, and the bosses grew quieter, their confidence tested by the relentless march of the government's case. Still, nothing was certain. Trials had collapsed before. Juries had surprised prosecutors. And Corallo's nickname, Tony Ducks, still carried weight. Could he duck again? Could he somehow slip through the government's net? Even now, even here? The courtroom drama captured the city's imagination, but for the men sitting at the defense table, it was something else entirely. It was the slow erosion of power, the realization that the silence that had protected them for so long was now being used against them. The Jaguar tapes weren't just evidence. They were a betrayal, the breaking of sanctuary that Corallo had trusted with his very soul. And as the trial moved closer to its conclusion, as the government pressed its case with unwavering determination, one question hung over the quiet dawn like a shadow. Would this be the moment when silence finally failed him? Chapter 22, Conviction of the Quiet Dawn. The room was so silent you could hear the shuffling of papers, the clearing of throats, the nervous tapping of a pen against a wooden bench. Then the foreman stood, his voice steady but weighted with history. Guilty. The word cut through the air like a knife, and for the first time in his long, disciplined life, Anthony Corallo, the quiet dawn, Tony Ducks, could not duck the blow. It was 1986 when the verdict landed, the culmination of the commission trial that had gripped the nation for more than a year. Corallo, along with other bosses of New York's 5 families, was convicted under the very law designed to destroy them, RICO. The Racketeer-Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act had been the government's most ambitious weapon, a law that treated the Mafia not as isolated criminals, but as a criminal empire. And now, it had done what decades of raids and trials could not. It had brought down Anthony Corallo. The sentence was staggering: 100 years in prison. For a man who had once built an empire on patience and discipline, the number was not just punishment, it was a death sentence. It meant he would never again walk the streets of New York, never again sit in the leather seats of his Jaguar office, never again watch construction cranes rise over a city that once moved to his quiet commands. The silence he had relied on for decades had finally betrayed him, and now it was all he had left. The courtroom erupted as the verdict was read. Reporters bolted for payphones, racing to deliver headlines that would run in bold type across the country. Federal agents exchanged looks of vindication, their years of frustration finally rewarded. Prosecutors, exhausted but triumphant, knew they had rewritten history. For the first time, the Mafia's ruling council, the commission itself, had been convicted as an organization. The shadow government that had once ruled New York's underworld had been dragged into the light and dismantled. Corallo sat still, his face betraying little. He had always been the master of composure, the man who let silence speak for him. But behind that calm, there had to be weight. He knew this was the end. No lawyer could appeal away a 100-year sentence. No friend in high places could soften the blow. No ducking, no dodging, no quiet deals could undo the sound of the foreman's voice ringing in his ears. The sentence was more than punishment. It was a message. The government wanted the world to know that no one, not even the bosses of the 5 families, could escape forever. The commission case wasn't just about crime. It was about power, about control, about proving that the state could outlast the silence of men who had ruled for decades with whispers and shadows. And Corallo, the embodiment of that philosophy, became its symbol. For the underworld, the verdict was devastating. Soldiers whispered in disbelief. Associates looked over their shoulders, wondering who might be next. The Mafia had always thrived on myth, the myth of untouchable bosses, the myth of an unbreakable code, the myth of silence as invincibility. But now, that myth had been shattered in open court. The commission itself was no longer a rumor. It was evidence. It was testimony. It was conviction. The trial and its verdict sent ripples through the 5 families. Power vacuums opened. Ambitious lieutenants jostled for control. Blood spilled in the years that followed as new bosses rose to fill the gaps left by men like Corallo. The golden era of stability he had once nurtured gave way to an age of paranoia, betrayal, and decline. And it all traced back to the day the Jaguar tapes played in court, exposing the quiet words that had once felt safe behind glass and steel. For Anthony Corallo, the downfall was almost poetic. He had built his life on silence, on patience, on avoiding the spotlight. He had outlasted rivals who had been louder, flashier, more violent. He had risen precisely because he had not fallen to pride or recklessness. Yet in the end, it was his calm voice, recorded without his knowledge, that sealed his fate. The very discipline that had protected him became the evidence that destroyed him. Prison became his new world. Gone were the tailored suits, the chauffeur-driven cars, the quiet dinners where deals were made with a nod and a glance. In their place came bars, guards, and the endless ticking of time. 100 years. A number so large it stripped away hope. For a man in his 70s, it was not just a sentence. It was the closing of a chapter, the end of an empire written in whispers. The FBI and prosecutors celebrated the verdict as the beginning of the Mafia's end. Giuliani stood before cameras, declaring that the commission had been dismantled, that organized crime would never again rule New York the way it once had. For the public, it was proof that the myths of the Mafia were real, and that even those myths could be broken. But for those who had lived in Corallo's world, the verdict carried a different weight. It was a reminder of fragility, of how quickly the illusion of invincibility could vanish. Men who once believed in the shield of silence began to question it. Informants multiplied. Trials followed. The dominoes of organized crime, once so carefully stacked, began to fall one by one. Anthony Corallo faded into the background of history, his life defined by both his mastery and his downfall. To the end, he remained a quiet Don, calm, disciplined, never loud, never reckless. But history would remember him not just for the empire he built, but for the trial that sealed its fate. The courtroom that day in 1986 was more than a place of judgment. It was the stage where an era ended, where silence itself was broken, where the quiet Don's ducking finally failed. And as the gavel came down, as the 100-year sentence echoed through the halls of justice, one truth lingered in the air. The age of whispers was over. Chapter 23. Life Behind Bars. The steel door clanged shut with a sound that seemed to echo forever. For decades, Anthony Corallo had commanded a city with whispers, his power hidden behind boardroom silence and the hum of a Jaguar engine. But now, in the bowels of Marion Federal Penitentiary, there was nothing left to command. No lieutenants waiting for orders. No construction magnates paying envelopes of tribute. No chauffeurs circling New York streets. Just bars, walls, and the steady march of time. Marion was not just a prison. It was the fortress where the government placed men it considered too dangerous, too influential, too unbreakable for ordinary confinement. It had been designed as a new kind of cage, a replacement for Alcatraz, a place where isolation itself became punishment. Inmates spent most of their hours in cells barely bigger than closets, contact with the outside world reduced to scraps. For the quiet Don, who had thrived on control and communication, it was the cruelest irony. Silence, once his greatest weapon, now became his captor. The adjustment was slow, grinding, and relentless. Corallo was already in his 70s when he entered Marion, carrying with him the weight of decades in the shadows. His body began to betray him. Joints stiffened. Breathing grew heavier. The once steady man who had carried himself with calm authority now moved with the weariness of age and confinement. The golden suit coats of Manhattan were replaced with prison khakis, the shine of polished shoes with scuffed prison boots. Time, which he had once measured in the rise of skyscrapers and the flow of envelopes, was now marked by meal trays and head counts. Yet even inside those walls, his reputation followed him. Other inmates whispered about the quiet Don, the man who had once sat at the commission table, the boss who had run unions and industries from the back seat of a car. To some, he was a relic. To others, he was still a symbol of power. But in truth, Corallo no longer held the reins. The family he had once controlled splintered in his absence, new leaders rising, new wars breaking out. His empire, so carefully managed with patience and restraint, was no longer his to guide. In the rare moments of reflection, perhaps he thought of the irony. He had built a life on discipline, on silence, on avoiding the spotlight. He had outlasted rivals who had fallen to violence or arrogance. He had lived long enough to see himself rise from a boy in East Harlem to one of the most powerful bosses in America. And yet here he was, reduced to a number, his days dictated by the clang of prison doors. The years at Marion wore him down. The isolation, the lack of freedom, the steady erosion of health, it all added weight. Heart problems surfaced. His body weakened. The long walks of New York streets were replaced by short, labored steps across a prison yard fenced with steel and topped with razor wire. The man once known for ducking every indictment now found himself unable to duck the inevitability of age. Still, his composure never fully broke. Guards noted his quiet demeanor, his unwillingness to cause trouble, his acceptance of routine. Even in prison, he carried himself with a calm restraint that had defined him. But beneath that composure, there must have been moments of regret, of reflection, of wondering if all the years spent building an invisible empire had been worth the price. Letters came rarely, visits even less. The world outside moved on. New York changed. The Mafia itself changed. The old system of discipline and silence gave way to a new era of chaos, informants, and decline. The golden age he had once nurtured slipped into memory, and Corallo lived to see the Mafia's reputation tarnished by betrayal and weakness. The fortress of silence he had believed unbreakable crumbled, not from the outside, but from within. In Marion, nights stretched long. Alone in his cell, with only the sound of distant footsteps and clanging doors, perhaps he replayed the moments that had defined his life. The rise through East Harlem streets, the mentorship under Tommy Lucchese, the quiet boardroom of the commission, the Jaguar rides, filled with smoke and strategy, and finally, the courtroom where his own words sealed his fate. There was no escape now, no ducking, no final twist of fortune. The 100-year sentence had locked him in place, and time itself was the jailer that would not be bribed or avoided. By the late 1980s, his health declined rapidly. Marion's cold walls seemed to close tighter. The man who had once moved unseen through the city now lived in the harsh visibility of prison counts and medical charts. His name still carried weight on the outside, but his body carried little strength within. He had always been the quiet Don. Now, in the stillness of his final years, silence became absolute. No more deals, no more whispers, no more strategy. Only the sound of a life measured not in power, but in decline. And as his health faltered further, as the years dwindled into days, Anthony Corallo must have felt the final truth settling over him. He had built a life in the shadows, a career on patience and silence. He had outsmarted the feds again and again, ducking every trap they set. But in the end, time caught him. The quiet Don's empire faded, his family splintered, his body weakened. The man who had once seemed untouchable was now just another prisoner, waiting for the inevitable end. And beyond the bars of Marion, the world that had once been his to shape was already moving on without him. Chapter 24: Death of Tony Ducks. The cell was quiet, the kind of silence that pressed down like a heavy blanket. By the year 2000, Anthony Corallo was 87 years old, his body frail, his health failing. The man who had once run unions, controlled industries, and whispered strategies from the back seat of a Jaguar now lay confined to the slow rhythm of prison life. The quiet Don, Tony Ducks, had finally run out of time. For years, the inevitability had been clear. His 100-year sentence, handed down in 1986, was not meant for survival. It was a statement, a symbolic punishment that ensured he would never again taste freedom. Prison had become his world, his days measured by counts, his nights marked by the steady ticking of a clock in the dark. He had lived long enough to see his empire crumble, his family splinter, and the golden era of the Mafia dissolve into betrayal and decline. But he had also lived long enough to become one of the last of a generation, the old-school bosses who ruled with patience, silence, and calculation. The decline came gradually. His health eroded, worn down by age and confinement. Heart problems grew worse. His once sharp eyes dimmed. The man who had sat at the commission table with quiet authority now struggled just to move through the corridors of Marion. Guards saw an old man, a shell of the power he had once been. But they also knew his history, and in whispers, his name still carried weight. In those final years, he had little left but reflection. The life he had lived stretched back nearly a century, from the streets of East Harlem in the 19-teens to the skyscrapers of New York that had risen under his shadow. He had seen prohibition, wars, booms, and busts. He had outlasted enemies, ducked indictments, and built an empire so carefully that for decades it seemed untouchable. Yet in the end, his story closed not with triumph, but with the slow erosion of time inside a prison cell. On August 23, 2000, Antonio Corallo died in federal custody, 87 years old. His passing marked more than the end of a man. It marked the end of an era. He was one of the last of the old bosses, the kind who had grown up in the age of prohibition, shaped their empires through unions and rackets, and ruled with quiet authority rather than reckless violence. His death closed a chapter in New York's underworld, a chapter that had stretched nearly the entire length of the 20th century. News of his death barely made headlines. By then, the Mafia was a shadow of what it had once been. The commission had been crippled, its leaders dead or serving life sentences. The families still existed, but they no longer held the city in the same iron grip. The golden age of mob power was gone, replaced by smaller crews, fractured loyalties, and constant surveillance. The world had moved on, and the quiet dawn faded into history with little fanfare. But for those who remembered, his death carried meaning. He was a symbol of a time when silence was strength, when patience was power, when the Mafia was run like a business rather than a spectacle. He was never the loudest, never the flashiest, never the most feared, but he was steady, disciplined, and cunning. He had built an empire not on bloodshed alone, but on control, order, and quiet influence. The irony was heavy. For a man who had built his legend on silence, his end came in the ultimate silence, the quiet passing of an old man behind bars. No final speeches, no dramatic escapes, no grand betrayals, just the steady march of time, closing in until there was nothing left. In the years that followed, his name would be remembered in books, documentaries, and whispers among those who studied the Mafia. Tony Ducks, the man who ducked the law for decades, only to be undone by his own voice captured on tape. The quiet Don, who believed silence would shield him, only to discover that silence had limits. His life became both a lesson and a warning, proof that patience could build empires, but also that no empire lasted forever. His death at Marion brought an end to the story of a man who had defined the Mafia's golden age, a man who had outsmarted rivals, outlasted prosecutors, and ruled with restraint. But it also left behind the image of a frail old man, alone in a cell, 100-year sentence still hanging over him, even as his life slipped away. The story of Antonio Corallo was not one of glory or spectacle. It was one of shadows, of discipline, of quiet power built and eventually dismantled. His death closed the final chapter of a life lived in whispers, a life where silence had been both his greatest weapon and his ultimate undoing. And yet, even as he faded into history, the question lingered. If the quiet Don had been born in another time, if he had chosen another path, could his discipline and patience have made him a titan in legitimate business? Or was he always destined for the shadows, always bound to build an empire that could only end in bars and silence? In the end, there was no answer. Only the memory of a man who had once seemed untouchable, and the reality of his quiet death behind prison walls. Chapter 25: Legacy of the Quiet Dawn. The cell door shut on August 23, 2000, and with it closed a life that had stretched from the crowded streets of East Harlem to the highest council of the Mafia. Antonio Corallo, the Quiet Dawn, Tony Ducks. His story ended behind bars, but his influence lingered far beyond the prison walls. The question that echoed after his death was not just how he lived, but how he would be remembered. For decades, Corallo had been the embodiment of a certain kind of mafia boss. He wasn't a showman. He wasn't a gunman. He wasn't the kind of man to stand on street corners, barking orders with a cigar clenched between his teeth. He thrived in the background, in the shadows, in the quiet spaces where power really lived. His reign was built not on flash, but on patience. Not on brute force, but on discipline. That, more than anything, became his legacy. Other bosses had craved the spotlight. They built reputations on violence, on fear, on headlines splashed across the tabloids. But Corallo understood that attention was poison. Every camera flash, every newspaper story, every whispered boast was another step closer to prison. He chose another path. He built his empire through unions, construction contracts, trucking routes, and sanitation monopolies. Businesses that seemed ordinary to the public, but were lifelines of power to the underworld. This approach made him harder to catch, harder to understand, harder to see. Law enforcement often knew his name, but couldn't prove his crimes. Time after time, indictments fell apart, charges dissolved, and Tony Ducks walked free. His ability to duck the law became legend, a nickname that carried both respect and frustration. To prosecutors, he was a ghost. To his men, he was a shield. And to his rivals, he was a reminder that power could be quiet and still command the city. Yet no man, no matter how disciplined, could stay invisible forever. His downfall came not from arrogance or betrayal, but from the relentless march of technology. The Jaguar that he had trusted as his mobile fortress became the stage for his undoing. Hidden microphones captured his calm, measured voice, and for the first time, the quiet dawn silence betrayed him. Those tapes didn't just convict him. They rewrote the history of law enforcement's war on the Mafia. They proved that even the most cautious, most disciplined boss could be reached. And yet, in a strange way, that too became part of his legacy. Corallo's fall wasn't the end of his influence. It was the beginning of a new era of caution. Bosses who came after him studied his life, his methods, his mistakes. They admired the way he built power quietly, without drawing fire. They learned from his ability to duck charges for decades. And they feared the way technology finally caught him, reminding them that no sanctuary was safe forever. Within the Mafia, Corallo was remembered as a boss who understood the balance between power and exposure. He wasn't reckless like Paul Castellano, who flaunted wealth with his mansion and stakes. He wasn't hot-headed like Carmine Galani, who met his end in a hail of bullets. He wasn't a flamboyant celebrity like John Gotti, whose craving for the spotlight became his downfall. Corallo's reign was marked by order, stability, and restraint. His family thrived under his leadership, avoiding the bloody wars that tore others apart. That steadiness left an imprint on how future bosses thought about power. But his legacy wasn't just within the Mafia. It was also within law enforcement. The commission case, built on his Jaguar tapes, became the blueprint for dismantling organized crime across the country. Prosecutors realized that to defeat the Mafia, they had to think big, target structures, and use RICO to attack the entire system. The success against Corallo emboldened the FBI, reshaped strategies, and ultimately contributed to the decline of the Mafia as a whole. In a way, the Quiet Dawn's conviction was both a victory for the government and a warning to every criminal enterprise that believed silence alone could save them. For the public, his memory is quieter still. He never became a household name like Gotti. He didn't dominate headlines with shootouts or betrayals. But to those who knew the history, his story stands as a reminder that not all power is loud. Sometimes it is the calmest voice in the room, the man who listens more than he speaks, the man who builds without boasting, who proves to be the most dangerous. Even in death, his legacy raises questions. Was he a criminal mastermind who outsmarted the law for decades? Or simply a disciplined survivor who delayed the inevitable? Was he a visionary who kept the Mafia alive through business and restraint, or a relic whose empire crumbled the moment technology pierced his silence? Perhaps the truth lies somewhere in between, a man both feared and admired, undone not by arrogance, but by the changing tides of history. Antonio Corallo's life reminds us that power can be quiet, but it is never permanent. He ruled in whispers, but the world around him grew louder. He ducked the law again and again, but in the end, no man can duck forever. His influence endures not in the skyscrapers he helped control, or the unions he bent to his will, but in the lessons learned by those who came after, on both sides of the law. And so the quiet dawn story closes where it began, in silence. A silence that once shielded him, that once made him untouchable, that once defined his reign. A silence that eventually became his undoing. A silence that still lingers, whispering reminders about the cost of shadows and the fragility of power. But the final question remains, unanswered, lingering like smoke in the air. Was Tony Ducks truly outsmarting the feds for all those years? Or were the feds simply waiting, patient as he was, for the day his silence would slip?